Hey guys, tonight we're heading back to the early 1900s, somewhere in the English countryside, where winter doesn't just nip at your nose, it gnaws at your soul. You've got a small farm, a family to feed, and about 3 months of grey sky hanging over your head like an unpaid bill. This isn't some nostalgic postcard of chimney smoke and sleigh rides. No, this is real. This is Edwardian farming during the coldest months of the year. And let me just say right up front, you probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always wonder what corner of the world you're in when we take these little nighttime journeys. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It begins in the bitter pre-dawn, when the dark outside your window feels more like a presence than a time of day. The fire's gone out in the kitchen hearth. You can see your breath in the room, curling in ghostly wisps above the patchwork quilt that smells faintly of hay and old mutton fat. You're not waking up refreshed. You're waking up because the cold slipped through the cracks and dragged you back to life. Your nose is raw, your toes are stiff, and your first thought isn't good morning, it's how bad is it out there today? There's no alarm clock, no warm hallway, no central heating. You grope around in the dark for your underlayers. Wool maybe, or linen if you're lucky. Your outer shirt has ice in the creases. Yesterday's socks are still damp. You jam your feet in anyway, the floor is like stone. You already know that the water in the pitcher is frozen, oh so frozen solid, which is fine. You weren't planning on washing today anyway, or tomorrow, or much this week. Outside, the sky begins to bloom into a cold blue-grey. The barn roof is covered in snow, and the fields are hard and white, edged by black leafless hedges that look like clawed hands stretching out of the ground. Your boots crunch with each step as you walk the narrow track to the outhouse. You hold your breath because it's not just cold, it's offensively, disrespectfully cold. The kind of cold that laughs at your layers, the kind that climbs up your spine and settles somewhere in your bones. There's ice on the inside of the window panes and frost on the nails sticking out of the doorframe. You feed the chickens first, assuming the fox hasn't got to them. You lost one last week, just a pile of feathers in the snow and a few grim tracks leading off into the brush. The hens are huddled together in the corner of their coop, their breath visible in tiny clouds. You break the ice off their water basin with a rusty spade, same as you do every morning, same as you'll do tomorrow. Then it's on to the cows. They're big steaming beasts that complain with low moos as you open the stall doors. Your breath mingles with theirs in the dim, hay-scented air. They're warmer than your house. You lean against one for a moment, stealing a little body heat. Just for a second. You'll milk them by hand, your fingers barely working in the cold, and pray they don't kick the pail. This morning one does. Of course she does. You swear under your breath and start again. The milk will be breakfast. A thick hunk of bread, a smear of lard, and hot milk with maybe a bit of sugar if you're lucky. Your teeth hurt when you bite into the bread. It's that hard, and you're not sure if it's the crust or your gums that gave first. One historical fact. In Edwardian England, over 80% of the population still relied on coal, peat or wood fires for heating, and many rural homes were barely insulated, just brick or stone walls with no inner lining. Some cottages were so poorly built that snow could blow in through the roof. And here's your fringe fact. Some families used pigs, actual live pigs, as makeshift bed warmers. The animal would sleep in a wooden drawer beneath the bed or even on a blanket next to the children, radiating heat through the night. Not glamorous, but hey, it worked. Now here's the part that keeps historians debating. Just how bad were those winters really? Records show deep freezes in the early 1900s, but rural memory often exaggerates. Some say those years were some of the coldest in the 20th century. Others argue it was more the lack of proper heating and diet that made the winters feel brutal. The truth? Probably somewhere in between, but ask any elderly farmer from the Dales or the Fens, and they'll swear the snow was taller than the horses. Back in your kitchen, someone's lit the fire again. Probably your mother or your wife. Or if you're on your own, it was you, shivering in front of a reluctant flame, feeding it kindling like you're negotiating with a small angry god. The kettle boils eventually, spitting like it resents being woken. You drink from a chipped mug that scalds your hands but finally warms your chest. And for one beautiful, fleeting moment, you're not freezing. Then it's back outside. The day's just begun. Snow's coming again. You can smell it in the air. You sigh, adjust your scarf and get to work. Because work is all there is, and winter doesn't care if you're tired. There's no such thing as being fashionably late when you're a farmer in Edwardian winter, because fashion is the first thing to go when the temperature drops below the reach of logic. You dress to survive, not to impress. You could be layered in 6 feet of wool, smelling like damp hay and boiled onion, and no one would blink. You're not aiming for elegance. You're aiming not to die of exposure before breakfast. It starts with your base layer, usually a coarse wool undershirt that itches like a curse and traps sweat like a sponge. You tried wearing cotton once. That was the week your left foot stopped having feeling in the big toe for a full day. Never again. Over the wool goes another shirt, maybe flannel if you're lucky, though it probably used to belong to your grandfather. The collar's torn and the buttons don't match, but it's soft from years of wear and doesn't scratch you like the first layer does. Then your trousers, thick, scratchy wool again, with patches sewn over patches. You always keep twine in the pockets, just in case. For what? Doesn't matter. You'll know when you need it. Your socks, 2 pairs, one dry and one almost dry, go on next, and over those, stiff leather boots lined with hay, because actual wool lining is too dear, and you already used the last bit of rabbit fur to repair your mittens. The hay gets changed every couple of days. It starts out crisp and golden, ends up grey and crushed like everything else around here. Now, onto the outerwear. A thick, almost ankle-length coat, heavy enough that putting it on feels like carrying another person on your back. Some days it feels like wearing a corpse. It smells like mildew, smoke, animal grease, and something else you've stopped trying to identify. A scarf knitted by someone who probably didn't love you enough to get the length right, and a wool cap with a hole near the crown which lets the wind whistle against your scalp like it's trying to tunnel in. Mittens, not gloves, because mittens keep fingers together and warm. Your gloves are for summer, all 2 weeks of it. You don't go outside, you armour up and face the elements like a knight heading into battle. The wind slices down the lane between your cottage and the barn like it's been waiting for you all night. It whistles past the eaves and rattles the loose tin above the woodpile, mocking you. Your ears ache, your eyelids sting, but you're dressed for it at least. Well, mostly. The cold always finds a way in, like a debt collector with a master key. A quick historical sidebar here. It wasn't until after World War I that thermal undergarments began to appear in common working-class use. During the Edwardian period, farmers often relied on multiple layers of rough wool and animal skins. It was functional, but not particularly warm if wet, and almost always wet. And here's a weird little fringe detail. Some Edwardian farmers believed that tying a red woolen thread around the neck or wrist could trap body heat and protect against colds. It didn't work, obviously, but it gave them a strange sort of hope, which in itself was valuable. A lucky charm against the flu, or maybe just loneliness. Now for the debate. Were Edwardian farmers really underdressed for the cold? Some accounts from rural gentry suggest they were nearly naked compared to the upper classes, which might sound dramatic. But oral histories from surviving labourers often insist they were more prepared than people give them credit for, just not by modern standards. It's possible both views are true depending on where in the country you were and how many pennies were left at the end of harvest. Your neighbour, a grizzled man named Thomas with hands like cracked leather and a beard that looks like it's seen 3 monarchs come and go, always wears the same coat all year round, says the body heats itself if you mind your work. He's also missing 3 toes and doesn't feel cold anymore, on account of his nerves being burned out by the frost 20 years ago. You choose not to follow his example. You remember last year when young Elsie, the dairymaid down the road, got caught in the storm without her coat, took shelter under a collapsed shed wrapped in only her apron and prayer. She survived mostly, lost 2 fingers, now uses her palm to carry buckets like a paddle. The winter doesn't forgive fashion mistakes, and yet there's a strange pride in how you layer up, like a ritual. You know where every hole is, where the seams rub, where the buttons snag. Each piece has a memory stitched into it. That second sweater? Your sister made it before she left for Manchester. The boots? Handed down from your father, patched a dozen times over. The coat? Pulled off a scarecrow during the war years and relined with whatever you could scavenge. There's even a pencil mark on the sleeve where your cousin once used it to write a list of debts in the pub. You move slowly in all this fabric, like a lumbering bear with arthritis. But better slow than frozen, better layered than buried. And let's not forget, once you're dressed, you're still cold. The clothes don't fix it. They just delay it. The cold lives in your nose, your fingertips, your knees. The clothes keep it from killing you quickly. That's all. You'll be cold until April, then wet until June, and maybe, just maybe, comfortable for a week or two before autumn rolls in again like an old enemy with new tricks. You tie your scarf tighter. You test your boots in the icy mud outside the barn. You brace for another full day in a world that wants to turn you into a popsicle with responsibilities. And off you go. You don't really wake up in the Edwardian winter. You thaw gradually, like an old joint of meat someone left too close to the fire. And once you're up and dressed, stiff and miserable, your first real task isn't milking or feeding the pigs. It's survival. And survival right now means getting that hearth fire roaring like it's your only friend in the world, which, if we're being honest, it kind of is. The fire isn't optional. It's not ambience. It's life insurance. You look at the fireplace the same way a drowning man might look at a life raft. There's no central heating, no radiators. Your entire home relies on one angry pit of orange flame to keep the cold from creeping in and curling around your ribs like ivy. The fire goes out, so do you. So you start your morning with the ritual. Fire building. Not romantic, sparkly flint and steel fire building. This is down on your knees, soot on your hands, breath clouding, curse muttering fire building. First, you clear the ash from last night, careful to leave the tiniest hint of embers, gold dust in the freezing dark. Then you stack kindling like you're laying a trap, dry twigs snapped from the bundle you tucked under the bed last week. Bigger sticks next. Maybe a bit of twisted newspaper if you've got any left. Though yesterday you used the last of the grocer's wrapping to stuff a gap under the door. You strike the match, hands shaking. One flare, then smoke, then, if you're lucky, the first flicker of flame. And then you breathe. You feed it slowly, whispering to the flame like it's a child you're trying to coax out of a tantrum. Too fast and it dies. Too slow and it laughs at you. If you've done it right, soon the logs are cracking and the room's temperature has climbed a full degree. 2, if you're blessed. You hold your hands close, not too close or you'll scorch your knuckles, and let your fingers begin to remember what sensation feels like. The problem is fuel. Firewood, good firewood, is harder to come by than you'd think. Not every farm has a nice little stand of trees out back. If you didn't spend the summer and autumn chopping, drying, and stacking, you're in trouble now. And even if you did, you might find that the stack you worked so hard on is now soggy from unexpected rain, or frozen through from a week of ice storms. Wet wood burns dirty and weak, and it smokes up the entire kitchen, leaving everything, food, clothes, even your skin, smelling like the inside of a poorly managed crematorium. So you get creative. You burn peat if you can dig it. You use straw and twisted bundles of hay, though they burn fast and hot and leave you cold again 10 minutes later. You burn dung. Yep, you heard that right. Cow pats and horse droppings, dried and flattened and stacked like grotesque pancakes behind the barn. It's not pleasant, but it burns slow and warm, and the smell's just another layer in your already weird-smelling house. Honestly, at this point, if it catches fire and doesn't explode, it's fuel. Here's your historical fact of the night. Many Edwardian rural families burned a combination of wood, peat and animal dung to keep their fires going, especially in regions with fewer trees. The practice of dung burning was widespread across the world, but in British farming households, it was considered a sort of last resort fuel that quickly became the norm when wood supplies ran low in late winter. Now get this quirky little fringe bit. Some Edwardian households used what's called a fire dog, a hollow metal tube placed in the hearth to draw in air and keep the fire burning hotter and longer. But in some areas, old farmers believed that if you used a borrowed fire dog, you'd inherit the other family's bad luck for the winter. So people would rather freeze than borrow one from a neighbour, because nothing says communal farming like petty superstitions about cast iron. And of course there's an ongoing debate among historians about how sustainable the Edwardian household heating systems really were. Were rural families burning too much fuel too fast? Was there deforestation on a small scale? Some argue that by relying on alternative fuels like dung and peat, they actually preserved the woodlands around them. Others say that these methods were a direct result of neglect, poverty and desperation. Again, probably a bit of both. People did what they had to do, not because it was ideal, but because winter didn't wait for long-term strategies. Back to you, crouched by the fire, poking the embers with an iron rod that's bent at the tip and has probably been in the family longer than any of your furniture. You can't stay there long though. There's no luxury in sitting by the fire all day, no matter how bitter the wind is outside. The chores are calling. There's always more to do, but before you go, you prep the hearth for the rest of the day. You stack the wood nearby, enough for the next meal at least. Maybe you'll have to light it again later if it goes out. And it might. You never quite know how long it'll last, especially if someone leaves the door open or if the wind picks up. As you rise, knees popping, you feel the warmth on your back fading already. The cold rushes to reclaim you, like it's been watching and waiting for the moment you stopped guarding your fire. The war isn't over. You've just won a skirmish. There's a pot to put on next. Maybe porridge if you have oats left. Maybe stew if yesterday's rabbit didn't turn. You'll need that fire again tonight too. Someone's got to dry their socks over it. Someone's going to sit in front of it while they sew a button or cough into a rag and wonder if it's just the chill or something worse. You step back out into the white silence, smoke curling from the chimney behind you like a lazy ribbon. Inside, the fire keeps burning. For now. You know it the moment you step outside. There's a certain kind of quiet that only comes when the world's been wrapped in snow thick enough to smother sound. Even your boots don't crunch right. It's more of a muffled thud, like walking on old cake. The path to town, if you can still call it a path, is buried under at least a foot of powder, and that's not counting the frozen ruts underneath from the last thaw. You squint toward the hedge line, where the road disappears around a bend, and you can already feel your stomach twisting. You have to go today. Supplies are running low, and someone's used the last of the salt on a pair of frostbitten hands. No one wants to make a supply run in the middle of winter. You do it because you don't have a choice. The farm's low on everything. Lamp oil, oats, flour, and that foul black syrup you mix with water to make something barely drinkable. You're down to the bottom of the medicine tin too, and the baby's had a cough since Sunday. If she makes it through the week without turning blue, you'll count yourself blessed. You load up the cart with a few sacks of turnips to trade, and one of those stringy rabbits you caught last week, already stiff with frost. The cart itself is a rickety wooden beast that creaks in protest when you slap the horse's flank and take the reins. The wheels are frozen to the earth. You hack at them with the side of a shovel, wincing every time the iron bites into the wood. Finally, with a groan and a cracking sound you hope isn't structural, the whole thing lurches forward. The road into town is barely that, just 2 tracks where cartwheels have worn into the mud, now frozen into solid lines of ice. The horse stumbles on them more than once, nearly spilling you into a ditch. Your hands are numb on the reins. The wind picks up, and for a few brutal seconds, you can't feel your nose at all. Every breath stings your lungs like breathing in crushed glass. You pull your scarf up higher, but it's stiff with frost and smells like wet dog and wood smoke. The trees lean over the road like mourners at a funeral, their limbs heavy with snow. You pass a stone wall with the top layer missing, collapsed under the weight of last night's frost. And just past it, a familiar shape. A cart tipped on its side, half buried in drift. The contents long gone. Whoever it belonged to is nowhere in sight. You try not to think about that too hard. Here's your historical fact. During the Edwardian period, especially in rural areas, most farms were at least an hour or more by cart from the nearest market town. Winter journeys often took twice as long, or longer, depending on conditions, and there were no snowplows or salted roads. Accidents and breakdowns were common, and if you got stuck, you were expected to dig yourself out, or wait for someone to find you, which could take days. And for a more bizarre fringe note, some farmers, particularly in the far north, swore by wrapping warm bricks or even heated potatoes in cloth and stuffing them under their coats or into their boots to keep their core temperature up on long rides. Others, less refined, used bottles of hot urine. Whatever worked. You weren't aiming for dignity, you were aiming for not freezing solid. Now, for the scholarly disagreement of the day, how often were these winter supply runs fatal? Some researchers believe the idea of brutal winter deaths on the road is more romantic folklore than fact, an exaggerated memory passed down through stories. Others argue that these deaths were just underreported, especially when it came to the poor or the transient. After all, if a farmhand or a drifter disappeared on the road in January, who exactly was filing the report? Back in your world, the horse slips again, this time bad. One leg goes out sideways, and for a second you think she's going down. You leap off the cart, boots vanishing into the snow up to your calves, and grab her bridle. She pants hard, steam pouring off her back. Her eyes roll wide, but she's steady at ease. You stroke her neck, whispering something that barely qualifies as soothing. Not because she understands, but because you need to hear the sound of your own voice. You press on. By the time you reach the village, your eyebrows are rimed with frost. Your beard, if you have one, is frozen in clumps, and your hands feel like stone. The main lane is just as miserable as the road out, churned into a brown slush by other carts, and now refrozen into uneven ridges that shake your bones with every turn of the wheels. You pull up outside the general store, a squat brick building with a crooked sign and a coal fire you can smell from 10 feet away. That smell hits you like a punch. Warmth, people, survival. You could cry if your tear ducts weren't frozen shut. Inside it's just as grim as you remember. Shelves half bare, the grocer hunched behind the counter like he's made of wax. He doesn't smile, but he nods, which is about as friendly as things get this time of year. You trade turnips for flour, some leftover butter for lamp oil, and hand over the rabbit in exchange for a cloth pouch of licorice root and camphor, meant for colds. You can't afford proper medicine. This will have to do. You linger by the fire for a minute too long. Just a minute. You know you can't stay, but it's warm and it smells like coal and old books, and someone's been baking something with treacle, and for the first time all day your feet start to feel like feet again. Then you're back on the cart, reins in hand, the wind cutting sharper now that you've had a taste of comfort. The return trip will be worse. The sun's lower, the shadows longer. You pray the horse holds up, you pray the wheels don't crack, you pray the wind doesn't change. You don't pray for warmth. That would just be greedy. The barn has always been more than a barn. In the dead of winter, it's a lifeboat. It's church. It's the only structure on the farm that somehow holds more heat than it loses, though that's not saying much. From the outside, it's nothing impressive. A sagging wooden frame leaning slightly to the east, patched with mismatched planks and rusting hinges, but when the wind is roaring across the fields like a creature with teeth, and the cold gets into your chest so deep you wonder if your heart might just shatter like pond ice, that barn starts looking like a palace. You swing the big doors open and are greeted by the deep animal warmth inside. It's not exactly cosy. There's the stench of manure, the damp funk of hay, and the constant shifting noise of beasts, but it's still better than the frozen air behind you. The horses snort when they see you, breath steaming in thick clouds. The cows blink slowly, half asleep in their stalls. Even the chickens make that low, complaining noise that sounds like a soft argument over space. You pull the doors shut behind you, sealing in the warm funk. It's strange how your body starts to relax the second you're inside, even when your boots are still soggy and your nose is dripping. There's something deeply comforting about the steady thrum of animals living. The chewing, the low moos, the occasional shifting of hooves. They're warm bodies, they're life. And out here, life is currency. During these cold months, you basically live in the barn. Not full time, you're still sleeping in your own bed when it's not filled with ice crystals. But everything else happens here. You repair tools here, you eat quick meals here. You even sneak a nap in the hay if the sun peeks out and makes the rafters glow for an hour or two. You start with the water. That's always the most pressing thing. The troughs are crusted with ice again. You crack them with a heavy mallet, the sound echoing like a gunshot. The animals crowd in, greedy for the fresh layer of water underneath. One of the goats butts another to get closer. You mutter a curse, rubbing your wrist where the mallet jarred the bones. The feed bins are half full, which is more than you expected. Still, you make a mental note to ration a little tighter. The cow feed goes quick in winter. They eat constantly, like stoves you have to keep stocked, but in return they keep the barn warmer. A cow puts off more body heat than most people realise. Stand next to one long enough and your gloves will dry out. Lie down in the hay beside one, on a particularly cold night, when the wind makes the walls creak and sleep won't come, and you'll stay alive. Not proud, just alive. Here's your historical fact. In many Edwardian farms, the barn wasn't just for animals. It doubled as a winter workspace and shelter. Farmers would often use the barn to store tools, complete repairs, and sometimes even move cooking or childcare into the space during the harshest spells. Animals, especially cows and pigs, provided crucial ambient heat in these shared environments. Now, a quirky fringe fact. Some rural folks swore by a tradition of bringing a small piece of coal into the barn and burying it under the feed trough to trap the cold. It didn't do anything, of course, but it was thought to trick the winter into staying buried like some kind of icy demon that could be fooled with symbolism. Old beliefs die hard, especially when the nights are long. And here's the scholarly question still debated in circles of historical agriculture nerds. Were these barns actually effective at insulating heat, or is that just how people remember it? Some records suggest that traditional wooden barns with hay insulation and animal density could keep the internal temperature as much as 10 degrees warmer than the outside air. Others argue that the perceived warmth was more psychological than physical, comfort born of routine and proximity to living creatures. Maybe it's both. Maybe surviving winter makes you remember any shelter as warmer than it really was. You finish spreading straw in the corners of the stalls, making sure the pigs aren't lying directly on the cold dirt. One snuffles your boot, trying to chew the laces. You nudge it away gently. They are all lazy and sluggish in the cold, but pigs are sensitive. They'll catch pneumonia if you don't watch for the signs, and dead pigs don't just smell worse than live ones. They're a huge loss in the dead of winter, when you can't afford to waste a single scrap of meat. A sound from the rafters, fluttering, then a single drop of something wet and foul, landing squarely on your hat. Of course, the doves again. You curse under your breath, then look up and spot 3 of them staring down at you like smug, feathered landlords. You tried blocking off the beams last year with netting, but they just tore through it. Now you just accept the occasional gift from above and move on with your life. You check the barn walls for drafts. There's always at least one. The wood shrinks in the cold and the wind finds every crack like it's reading a map. You stuff straw into the worst gaps, hammer loose boards back into place, and pray the storm they're whispering about at the market doesn't blow the roof off entirely. One year it did, split the whole west side open like a sardine tin. You slept in the root cellar for a week while the livestock howled into the night air. And yet despite everything, the smell, the mess, the danger, this is where you feel safest. The barn is steady, predictable. It doesn't surprise you. The animals don't lie. If they're sick, you know it. If they're hungry, they tell you. No hidden motives, no judgment. Just a quiet, steaming kind of companionship. You linger longer than you should, but you're not ready to face the wind again. So you find a dry spot in the hay, lean back against the wall, and close your eyes for just a minute. You listen to the slow rhythm of hooves shifting, and pigs snoring and hens clucking softly to themselves. The barn hums with life, and for a moment, you pretend it's enough. Just a moment. You don't realise how much your life depends on one stubborn, mooing beast, until winter turns the world into a block of ice, and the only thing standing between you and total collapse is a single, irritated cow. She's not glamorous. She smells like wet leather and old feed. She kicks when you're not fast enough, and she's definitely smarter than she lets on. But when the temperature drops and nothing else moves outside but the wind, that cow might as well be royalty. You trudge out to her stall every morning with the same bucket, the same stool, and the same tired greeting. She sorts, like always. You sit down, like always. You press your forehead against her warm side for just a second longer than necessary, just to feel something that isn't cold. Then the milking begins. Slow at first, your fingers aching from the cold. But the rhythm returns quickly enough, and soon the warm milk splashes into the pail, steam rising from the foam. You're not just doing this for a cup of tea. That cow, let's say her name's Molly because that sounds about right, is giving you more than milk. She's giving you warmth, literally. Her body heat raises the stall's temperature several degrees, especially if she's well fed and calm. You've even brought the younger kids in here on freezing nights, tucked them into hay near her side like piglets. Nobody questions it. You do what you have to do, and Molly does more than give milk. That milk gets churned into butter. Sometimes yogurt if the kitchen isn't colder than a glacier. You trade jars of cream for necessities at the village store. Sometimes you stretch it into porridge or oatcakes or whatever fills a belly. In a bad month, and they're all bad months in winter, you could survive entirely off what comes out of her. Here's your historical fact. In Edwardian England, the single-family cow was often the most valuable animal on a farmstead. While pigs and chickens were crucial for meat and eggs, cows provided daily sustenance in the form of milk and could produce up to 5 gallons per day, enough to feed a family, supplement neighbours, and even serve as informal currency through barter in isolated communities. And for a weird fringe twist, in some parts of rural Britain, it was believed that talking to your cow during milking would improve the quality of the milk and prevent the udders from turning sour. A quiet chant or a story told softly into the cold air was said to keep the milk flowing smooth and the cow calm. Whether that was true or not, you still find yourself mumbling nonsense to Molly now and again. It's a ritual, and frankly, she listens better than most people. But there's a harder truth behind it all. What happens if Molly goes down? You don't talk about it much, but it's always there, hiding behind every cough she lets out, or every time her legs wobble on the way to the feed trough. If she gets sick, you've got 2 options. Save her or butcher her. And butchering her, that's like losing your fireplace, your pantry and your wallet all in one blow. Plus, in this weather, getting through her hide is a nightmare. Frozen cow is practically stone. There's a story folks whisper about, even now, a farm a few miles over, where the cow died midwinter. No warning, no chance to prepare. The family buried her in a snowbank to keep the body cold, then slowly hacked away at her over 3 weeks like a grotesque larder. By spring the meat had gone grey, the barn reeked, and not one of them could touch beef again without gagging. Whether it's true or not, no idea, but you've thought about it, especially when Molly coughs. Sometimes you stay in the stall with her after milking, just sitting in the straw and listening to her breathe. Her sides rise and fall like bellows. She blinks slowly like she understands. You've been through a lot together. She was born in this barn, but you remember her legs wobbling like jelly when she stood up for the first time? You were just a kid then too. Now look at you. Both of you scarred and cranky, both still here. That stall has seen it all. You once pulled a splinter from your foot in there during a blizzard. You've cried in that corner, real ugly crying, the kind no one's supposed to see. You've patched coats, fixed boot soles, even read a damp newspaper by candlelight while leaning against her shoulder. Molly didn't mind. She just chewed her cud and ignored your drama like the queen she is. And it's not just you. Everyone on the farm depends on her. The baby gets warmed and milk with a bit of honey when her teeth come in. Your mother rubs cream into her cracked hands after chopping wood. The neighbour kid stops by every week for a pint. His dad too proud to beg but not too proud to accept. Even the cat waits by the pail, lapping up the spills before you can wipe them. Here's the academic wrinkle. Some historians argue that the family cow was the real foundation of rural resilience in the Edwardian period. Not the plough, not the man of the house, not even the crops. The cow provided sustenance, income, and even insulation during those freezing months. Others argue that it was the farm family, not the cow, that made the system work, the human labour and discipline that kept the wheels turning. But maybe they're both right. Maybe the truth is somewhere between man and beast, in that unspoken partnership forged through weather, need, and repetition. Outside, the wind howls again, pushing snow against the barn walls in little hissing flurries. Molly shifts in her stall, shakes her head, and lets out a low rolling bellow. It echoes through the rafters. You know what she means. The day's not done yet. There's work to do. She'll hold up her end. You've got to hold up yours. You stand, stretch your back, and run your hand along her side one last time before stepping out into the cold again. Her warmth fades quickly, and the chill hits you like a slap, but you take a breath and move forward. You've got Molly, and for now, that's enough. At this point in the winter, you don't expect comfort, but the bed still manages to disappoint. You shuffle into the bedroom long after the sun has vanished, if it ever showed up at all, and you can already feel the chill radiating from the sheets before you even peel them back. You know this feeling well. It's the sensation of sliding between two pieces of cold slate and hoping your soul doesn't escape your body during the night. There's ice on the inside of the window again, not outside. Inside, thin lace patterns spreading out from the corners like frost tattoos, beautiful in a detached, mildly horrifying way. Your breath hangs in the air like lazy ghosts drifting and curling above the mattress as you strip down just enough to sleep. You leave your socks on. Everyone leaves their socks on. Anyone who doesn't isn't taking winter seriously. Your bedding is a motley collection, layer upon layer of wool blankets, old quilts patched so many times the patterns don't match anymore, and one particularly suspicious fur throw that smells vaguely like wet dog and mothballs. Somewhere under all that, there's a mattress stuffed with straw or wool clumps, long since compressed by 100 cold nights and heavier dreams. Lying down is less about softness and more about surrender. You go horizontal, that's all. Nobody here's chasing luxury. But the worst part, that first 30 seconds, that moment when your body hits the sheets and the cold hits you back, it creeps up your spine, slithers into your collar and makes a quick move for the kidneys. It's not romantic. There's no curling up in a snug cocoon. This is warfare. You hunch your shoulders and ball your fists and wait for your own body heat to make the bed marginally less miserable. You try not to move too much, or you'll unleash a fresh wave of cold from beneath the blankets. Still, you shiver, you swear, you survive. Of course, if you were smart or just raised properly, you remembered the brick. Not just any brick, mind you. A heavy, oven-warmed clay brick. Wrapped in rags and tucked under the covers about half an hour before bedtime. Sometimes it's a hot water bottle if you've got one that hasn't cracked from repeated freezing and reheating. But the brick's more reliable. It holds heat longer and doesn't leak. Slide your feet down toward it now, and if it's done its job, you get that rarest of winter joys, a small square miracle of warmth amid an Arctic mattress. Here's a historical fact for you. In Edwardian homes, especially in rural areas without gas or electric heating, warming beds with bricks, stones, or metal pans filled with hot coals was common practice. These devices were typically heated in the fireplace and then carried carefully to the bed, sometimes in baskets or wool wrappings to avoid burns. Many families considered this simple ritual essential to getting even a few hours of uninterrupted sleep. And here's a fringe detail for those who like their history a little weirder. Some Edwardian farmers believed that putting a warm brick at the foot of the bed would not only keep your feet warm, but also draw out the chill from your bones. There were even folk beliefs that said cold feet could lead to nightmares or madness if not corrected, hence the importance of the warming ritual. You don't know about nightmares, but you've definitely had dreams about burning your toes on an overheated pan, so maybe there's something to it. Now, the scholarly debate. Was the lack of insulation in Edwardian farmhouses a product of ignorance, poverty, or just plain stubbornness? Some historians argue that many rural homes were designed more for summer ventilation than winter preservation. Others say it wasn't a design flaw, it was an economic reality. Bricks were expensive, double glazing unheard of, and insulation a luxury most farmers couldn't afford. Still others suggest that people simply didn't expect warmth indoors in winter. You bundled up, you toughed it out, and you saved the firewood for cooking and staying alive, not for being comfortable. Comfort, after all, was for other people. Rich people, town people. You heard once that the banker in town had a room that stayed warm even at night, but you assumed it was either witchcraft or an actual coal mine beneath the floorboards. Either way, not your problem. Sometimes, in the stillness of the night, the cold does something strange. It becomes a sound. A creak in the rafters, a shifting groan of ice outside the window, the pop of a log in the dying hearth. It talks to you in its own language, and lying there, wrapped in everything you own, you wonder if you'll ever truly feel warm again. Not just your skin, your bones. You try to remember what summer felt like, and your brain struggles to produce anything other than vague images of mud biting flies and sweat dripping down your back. Honestly, it doesn't sound great either, and you'll take it. Then there's sleep itself, which doesn't come easy. Your nose stays cold the whole night. Your knees knock against each other when the warmth slips. You curl tighter, instinctively turning toward the middle of the bed, trying to capture what little heat your body's managed to generate. If you're not alone in bed, you might scoot closer. But even that's tricky. People are warm, sure, but they're also selfish in their sleep. Elbows flail, legs twitch, and once someone steals the good blanket layer, it's a cold war with no winners. Eventually your body gives in. Exhaustion outweighs discomfort, and your thoughts slow to a crawl. You stop trying to fight the cold and simply sink into it the way one sinks into the inevitable. You know that in 6 or 7 hours you'll have to peel yourself out of this cave of wool and misery, and do it all over again. But for now, in this thin slice of dark, there is stillness. And if you're lucky, the brick stays warm until morning. You don't eat well in winter, let's just put that out there. You eat enough, barely. You eat what doesn't rot, what hasn't frozen solid, what the rats haven't stolen or the damp hasn't ruined. Meals are an exercise in creative repetition, and every bite reminds you how much you miss summer's softness. Tomatoes warm from the vine, peas sweet enough to eat raw, even the bitterness of kale before frost turned it to mush. But now, in the heart of winter, you eat from the cellar. And the cellar doesn't care about your feelings. It starts with a trapdoor in the kitchen floor. You lift it and are immediately hit with the smell, earthy, sour, damp, and somehow still metallic. The cellar is not a place you linger. It's a place you go into hunched and come out of fast. The stairs are uneven, the air is still, the walls bead with condensation on warmer days and sweat salt when the cold creeps in too fast. But below all that, stacked like treasure in a dragon's hoard, is what you hope will keep you alive until spring: root vegetables, and so many root vegetables, potatoes, turnips, carrots, beets, coated in soil crammed in bins or burlap sacks, their skin growing wrinkled and soft in some places, sprouting in others. You hold a parsnip up to the lantern light and turn it in your hand. It's good enough. Not perfect. Nothing is perfect anymore. You add it to your basket along with some sprouting onions, and the least suspicious apple you can find, its skin shriveled but still intact. The cellar's where you keep the jars too, preserves from the months when the world was green and edible. You scan the dusty shelves, a few jars of raspberry jam, cloudy with age, a sealed crock of pickled eggs, maybe a chutney or two if you can stomach it. You find a lone jar of gooseberries and let yourself feel something like joy for 3 seconds. That'll be dessert, or bribery, or both. Historical fact, by the Edwardian era, most rural farm families relied heavily on root cellars and preserved goods to survive the winter. Without refrigeration, preservation methods like pickling, drying, salting and jamming were essential. A well-stocked cellar could mean the difference between malnutrition and survival, especially in isolated farming regions, but even the best-planned stores had to stretch long past their prime by late winter. And here's a quirky little fringe detail. Some farmers hung horsehair or pigtails from the ceilings of their root cellars, believing it would ward off rodents or even keep the vegetables from sprouting too early. Others tucked old horseshoes in with the potatoes for luck. Did it work? Probably not, but superstition had its place, especially when your entire diet depended on a pile of slowly dying vegetables in a pit beneath your floor. Now for the scholarly debate. Were Edwardian root cellars truly effective at maintaining food safety across the full winter season? Some experts argue that many of the storage methods were outdated even by early 20th century standards, resulting in substantial waste. Others claim these systems, refined over generations, were incredibly effective when properly maintained. But properly maintained is doing a lot of heavy lifting there. One flood, one burst pipe, one rat infestation, and your survival stash turns into a fungal nightmare. Back upstairs, you dump the contents of your basket onto the table. Someone lights the stove and soon the air fills with that familiar tang of boiling onion skins and carrot tops. Tonight's dinner is going to be a stew again. It was stew yesterday. It will probably be stew tomorrow. Because when you don't have much, you boil it together and call it something hearty. You add oats if you need to thicken it. You add more water if you want it to last longer. You lie and say it tastes better than last time. Everyone eats with slow, quiet determination. There's no pretending. You don't take second helpings unless someone passes theirs over. You don't waste crusts. Even the pickiest child is too tired and hungry to complain, and that's saying something. The stew is hot at the least. That's something. You spoon it into your mouth and let the heat linger on your tongue. The chunks of vegetable are soft, some a little slimy, sure, but very food. And you chew, you swallow, you're still here. After dinner, you scrape the pot with a crust of bread, gathering up every last bit of broth. Someone licks the ladle. Someone else offers to wash the bowl, just to run their hands in the warm water. You pour a little of the gooseberry jam into a shared dish. It's tart, shockingly so, after weeks of bland root stew. You take your time with it. You savour it in silence. Later, once the dishes are done and the fire's been fed again, someone asks what's left in the cellar. You try to answer casually. Plenty, we'll make it. But your brain is already calculating how many meals you can stretch from what's left. You mentally sort the good carrots from the soft ones. You think about the bag of flour that's running low. You wonder if you could boil nettles again. You wonder how much butter is really needed to make oatcakes. And always, in the back of your mind, there's the rot. Because rot comes for everything, even in the cold, even with straw, even with prayers. One bad potato can turn a sack into sludge. One jar with a loose lid can go sour overnight. Mould, mildew, rats, water, all enemies of your quiet little war against hunger. You check the cellar every morning now. You sniff every bin, you prod the sacks with the toe of your boot, just in case. Because winter is long, longer than you remember, even when you're in the middle of it. And the cellar doesn't grow food. It only counts down what's left. You wake up hungry again. Not starving, not yet, but that dull, gnawing kind of hunger that's always there now, just under your ribs like a whimper that never stops. Breakfast is yesterday's bread, reheated near the stove and smeared with whatever fat you scraped out of the bottom of the jar. You chew slowly, like someone trying to fool their body into thinking there's more coming. There isn't. Not today. And so, when the morning fire's lit and the chores are done and your stomach still feels like it's folding in on itself, you pull out the traps. They are not fancy. A few wire snares, some rusty metal jaw traps, and a small homemade box trap with a sliding door that creaks like it's crying when you open it. These are your backup plan, the emergency pantry. You check them once a day, sometimes twice when you're desperate or just hopeful. They're set deep in the woods behind the farm, hidden beneath shrubs and tucked beside narrow animal paths. You've learned over time where the rabbits go, how they move in winter, how they leave those tiny trails through the snow like whispers in white. You dress heavy, you always dress heavy, layered up like you're going to war, because in a way you are. Your boots crunch through the frozen field as you head toward the tree line. The wind is sharp today, slicing through the hedgerows, shaking the brittle branches above. You carry a small axe, part tool, part just in case. The woods are quiet. Not peaceful, nothing about this season is peaceful, but quiet in a way that sets your nerves on edge. No birds, no breeze, just the sound of your own breath and the snubbed snow squeaking beneath your soles. You make your way along the trap line, eyes scanning ahead. The first trap is empty. The bait's gone. Something clever, something faster than the steel, took the food and left the wire twisted. The second trap is sprung. A small shape lies in the snow, fur dusted with frost. A rabbit. Not fat, but not skin and bones either. You kneel and check, neck broken clean, not much blood. A quick death. You mutter a quiet thanks, out of habit. Maybe guilt. You reset the trap, tucking a few shreds of carrot inside and loop the rabbit by its back legs to hang from your belt. Further along, another snare is tangled, snow sprayed around it like a struggle happened. No rabbit this time, just a few dark drops in the snow and one tuft of fur. Something got there first. Maybe a fox, maybe the same one that's been nosing around the henhouse lately. You consider tracking it. Meat is meat, after all. But you don't have time today. The sun is already crawling lower. Winter doesn't give you much daylight, and darkness out here is more than inconvenient. It's dangerous. Historical fact for today. In Edwardian England, hunting and trapping small game was a routine part of rural life, especially during winter when food supplies dwindled. While poaching laws were technically in place, enforcement in rural areas was often lax, especially when the animals caught were for personal survival and not for sale. Rabbits, hares, and the occasional pheasant were the most common catches, and many families relied on them to supplement their diets through the colder months. And here's your fringe fact. Some old-timers swore that singing while setting traps would soften the animal's heart, making it less likely to escape. Others believed that using a piece of cloth worn next to the skin, something with your scent, would attract rabbits faster. Science doesn't support either, but hunger doesn't wait for peer review. Now, let's hit the scholarly disagreement. Just how widespread was the reliance on wild game in Edwardian farming communities? Some historians argue that families used game as a desperate last resort, only when stores ran out. Others suggest that trapping was a regular supplement, passed down through generations as part of traditional seasonal rhythms. There's truth in both. For some families it was survival, for others it was just Thursday. Back in the woods, you take the rabbit and start the slow trek home. It swings from your belt with each step, quiet weight against your hip. One rabbit won't feed everyone, not really, but it's something. And more than that, it's proof that you're still outsmarting the cold, still surviving, even now. You pass by a stream on your way back, a trickle of dark water barely moving beneath a crust of ice. You crack through it with your boot, scoop a handful of freezing water and drink. It stings your throat going down, but it's clean and it wakes something up in you. You splash a bit on your face and it burns. Your eyelashes freeze again almost instantly. The barn is a blur on the horizon, its roof white and sagging under snow. Smoke curls lazily from the chimney. It looks warm from a distance. It isn't. Inside, you gut the rabbit quickly. No ceremony, just business. The skin peels away in one clean pull, and the smell of fresh meat hits your nose, raw, warm, and faintly metallic. It's the best thing you've smelled in a week. The entrails go to the pigs, who fight over them like it's a banquet. You hang the meat in the cold pantry, knowing you'll stew it with onions and oats, and maybe a splash of cider if someone hasn't drunk it already. Dinner tonight will be better than usual. Not good, but better. There will be chewing, not just swallowing. There will be that rare sound around the table, satisfaction. And maybe, for once, you'll go to sleep full. There's a strange kind of wealth in winter, though you'd never guess it from looking at your pantry or your cracked fingers. It doesn't come from crop, or livestock, or even the occasional rabbit dangling from your belt. No, the wealth you're chasing now is colder, heavier, and gleams in the sunlight like blocks of frozen gold. You're harvesting ice, real, solid, back-breaking ice, and for a few brief weeks it's one of the most valuable things you can pull from the land. You can feel it in the air when the time comes. The pond stops steaming in the morning. The birds disappear entirely. Even the cows begin huddling closer at night. It takes at least a week of hard freeze to get the ice thick enough 4 inches at a minimum, 6 if you want to walk on it without the awful dread of hearing cracks under your boots. And today it's ready. You take the sled out early before the light is more than a grey smudge in the sky. The axe handle is splintered in your gloves. The saw blade still smells like the oil you rubbed into it last night. You carry everything down to the pond in silence. There's no one else awake yet, not even the chickens, and for a few quiet minutes you pretend this is just another peaceful task. Then you set to work and the illusion shatters like the surface you're standing on. The first cut is the hardest. The blade resists, shrieking through the frozen crust, sending up chips and dust that sting your face. You saw in long strokes, steady and even, across a chalk line you marked with ash. After the first line you score another, and another, until you've boxed out a slab the size of a coffin. Then you switch to the chisel. You kneel, already soaked from kneeling in slush, and drive it in. The crack sounds like gunfire. The ice breaks free with a deep groan, like the pond itself is complaining. You heave the block up with iron tongs and slide it onto the sled. It's heavier than it looks, solid, wet and slick as sin. Your shoulders burn and your back pop, and then you do it again and again because each block you pull is money in a cold economy. Ice doesn't grow, doesn't rot, and if you store it right, buried in sawdust in the old ice house, it'll last until summer. When June hits and the village butcher needs to keep meat cold, you'll be the one with the frozen stash. When the doctor wants to pack a feverish child in chilled linens, you'll be the one who can name your price. Here's your historical fact. In Edwardian England, especially in rural areas before widespread electric refrigeration, ice harvesting was an essential seasonal labour. Families and workers would cut ice from ponds and rivers in deep winter, storing it in insulated ice houses packed with straw or sawdust. Well-packed ice could last well into late summer, used for preserving meat, dairy, or even treating injuries and illnesses. And here's a particularly odd fringe practice. Some farmers believed that the first ice of the season, if taken under a full moon, would never melt completely. They'd keep a small piece in a linen pouch, hung above the hearth as a charm for health and long life. You're not superstitious, but you do notice you work a little harder when the moon's out. Maybe it's just the light. Maybe it's something older. Now, the debate among scholars, was ice harvesting more about tradition or true necessity? Some argue that by the early 1000s it had already begun to fade, replaced in wealthier homes by ice delivery from commercial suppliers and eventually electric fridges. But in rural England, far from the city and its newfangled luxuries, the practice thrived well into the 20s. The infrastructure wasn't there for anything better. If you wanted cold in July, you had to earn it in January. You stack the blocks carefully. They'll go to the ice house at the edge of the property, an old brick pit lined with thick timber and packed year-round with sawdust from the mill. You'll layer the ice with straw, cover it with canvas and check it weekly. If it holds, you're set for the season. If it doesn't, well, better not to think about that. By midday your clothes are soaked through, your hands are raw, your face feels sunburned even though the sun barely showed up. You've hauled a dozen blocks, each one a small fortune in the right circumstances, and you're not done. You eat your lunch standing up, stale bread and a wedge of cheese so hard it fights back, and drink from a leather flask that smells like pine sap and desperation. Then back to work. Each block you pull makes you feel more powerful in a strange, quiet way. You're stealing from the season, taking something it meant to hoard, turning winter's cruelty into something useful, even profitable. You imagine someone in town paying a few shillings in July for a piece of what you're dragging across the snow right now. You imagine offering it to a family with a sick child, or a neighbour with meat they're desperate to keep from spoiling. For once, winter's giving you something. Not much, but enough. As the sun dips low, casting long blue shadows across the field, you strap the last load and begin the slow haul back. The sled groans, your boots drag. The horse you borrowed for the day is barely interested, flicking her ears at you like she'd rather be dead than drag another block. You agree, but when you reach the ice house and slide open the heavy door, the air hits you. Cool, dry, and ancient smelling, and it feels like victory. You unload the blocks in silence, hands trembling, and then seal the door behind you. One more day of work. One more day of not freezing, not starving, not quitting. You walk back to the cottage with your arms sore and your shoulders burning, but there's a small grin pulling at the corners of your mouth. You're poor, sure, you're cold, but tonight You're rich in ice. They don't get snow days. That's the first thing to understand. There are no cancelled lessons, no sledding adventures, no cocoa by the fire while someone else clears the path. Your children, if you have them, work. Not because you're cruel, not because you don't love them, but because love alone doesn't feed the pigs or gather the eggs or scrub the soot from the hearth. And the farm doesn't stop when the snow falls. If anything, it gets worse. So they shoulder their little burdens with red noses and stiff fingers, bundled up in hand-me-down coats and boots 2 sizes too big. The older ones go out early, groggy and quiet, rubbing sleep from their eyes and carrying pails half their weight. You watch them trudge toward the barn, heads down, faces mostly hidden behind scarves. No complaints, or maybe just a muttered one under breath, the kind they hope you don't hear. You hear it anyway, you just pretend you don't. They start with the cows, of course, that old routine. Each child has a job, milking, feeding, mucking out the stalls. It's a grim kind of dance done by memory and muscle, with no room for wasted movements. The pails are heavy and slosh warm against their thighs. When the cow kicks, and she always does, there's no lecture, just a hissed curse and a glance at the bruise forming. One of the girls wipes her hands on her apron, then presses them to her cheeks to steal some warmth. It doesn't help. Inside, the little ones are no better off. Too small for livestock, but old enough to scrub pots or fetch water. They run between cold rooms with frozen toes and chapped lips, carrying firewood in their arms like offerings to the hearth. Their fingers are raw. They cry sometimes, but mostly in private when no one's looking. Even tears freeze if you stand still too long. One historical fact: Edwardian children in rural households were not just helpers, they were essential labour. Formal schooling was often part-time or seasonal, with many children only attending classes during the less demanding months. Winter, with its harsh needs and endless tasks, pulled children out of classrooms and into work. Boys worked the barn and the fields. Girls were expected to cook, clean, and care for younger siblings, sometimes from the age of 5 or 6. A strange little fringe detail. Some families gave their children a sip of spirits before the morning chores to warm the blood. Nothing heavy, just a splash of gin or cider vinegar in water, but enough to put colour back in their cheeks and take the edge off the frost. Doctors, of course, frowned on it. But most doctors lived in town, and out here, frostbite didn't care about recommendations. Here's the debate historians still chew on. Were Edwardian farming families overworking their children, or was it simply a necessity of survival? Some argue that the workload stunted development kept generations trapped in cycles of poverty and toil. Others insist these children developed resilience, independence, and life skills no classroom could teach. Truth be told, it depends on the family. Some kids grew up strong, others grew up tired. Most just grew up fast. Back on your farm, the middle boy, Thomas maybe, has come in tracking snow through the kitchen. His cheeks are flushed and he's got a cut on his knuckle from splitting kindling. He won't tell you how it happened, just shrugs and mumbles something about the axe jumping. You wash it with cold water, dab some ointment from a tin so old the label's worn blank, and wrap it with linen. He doesn't flinch. He's already thinking about the next chore. Lunch is thin porridge, served in chipped bowls around the hearth. Everyone eats fast, no one complains. They have learned not to. The baby gnaws on a crust of bread with gums that look sore, and the oldest girl helps spoon broth into his mouth between her own bites. Afterward, they all get 10 minutes to sit near the fire. That's the rule. 10 minutes, just enough to unfreeze their feet, just enough to feel like children again. Then it's back to work. You try to soften it where you can. You sew mittens from old socks, you line their boots with hay, you warm bricks and tuck them into the foot of the shared bed before they climb in. You make little jokes over supper to get a smile, tell them stories about the farm fox who wears boots and steals pies. But when the wind howls and the windows rattle, your oldest pulls the younger ones closer in bed like they're soldiers huddling in a trench. Childhood's a summer thing, winter belongs to something else. Outside, snow piles against the door again. You watch your daughter kick it aside with a shovel half her size, face set with determination that doesn't belong on a 12-year-old. She stops for a second to shake the snow from her mittens, then catches you watching through the window. She grins, you grin back, then she gets back to it. Because out here, everyone has a job. Everyone carries the weight. And sometimes the only warmth you get is the look of a kid doing the work of a grown-up and somehow still finding a way to smile. There's a kind of quiet that settles over the farm after the sun goes down, a hush so thick it feels like the world itself is holding its breath. The wind dies off, the animals tuck in, The fire in the hearth softens to a low glow, and you pull out the bottle. You don't drink because it's a celebration. You drink because it's cold and hard and endless out there, and sometimes the only thing that cuts through it is a mouthful of something that burns on the way down. Winter doesn't let up, it doesn't take pity, but with enough of the right kind of warmth in your chest, you can almost pretend that tomorrow might be easier. This isn't anything store-bought. You're not rolling into the village and dropping coin on brandy. No, this bottle is homemade. You, or someone in the house, brewed it in the back shed last summer, when the apples were too bruised for pies but not too rotten for fermentation. Or maybe it came from a neighbour, popped over the fence with a wink and the unspoken understanding that it wasn't exactly legal. But nobody out here cared much about that. You keep it in a brown jug, stashed behind the chimney where the heat stops it from freezing solid. Sometimes it's cloudy, sometimes it's clear, sometimes it smells like nail polish. You sniff it anyway, take a cautious sip, and nod in approval when it doesn't peel the lining from your throat. Close enough to cider, closer to moonshine. It does the job. Tonight you pour just a finger's worth into a tin cup and sit near the fire, letting the warmth and the fumes mix. The cup clinks faintly as your hand trembles. Not from age, from cold and from a long day. You raise the drink like a toast, though no one's there to see it, and mutter something like cheers to the shadows. Here's your historical fact. While commercial alcohol was available during the Edwardian period, it was often too expensive for poor rural families. Homebrewing was widespread, and farmers commonly fermented their own cider, perry, beer, or even basic fruit wines using family recipes passed down for generations. While technically the subject to regulations, homemade alcohol in the countryside was largely ignored unless someone got poisoned or rowdy. Now your quirky fringe fact. Some Edwardian families swore by a specific mixture for winter cheer, a blend of warm milk, honey, nutmeg, and a generous splash of homemade brandy. Served before bed, it was thought to prevent colds, ward off night terrors, and help you sleep like a prince. More often, it just made you snore louder and forget your chilblains for a few hours. And the scholarly debate was rural alcohol consumption in winter about necessity or excess? Some historians argue that the uptick in drinking during colder months reflected a psychological need, a way to fight off the isolation, the depression, the cabin fever. Others argue it was simply cultural, a continuation of harvest celebrations and pre-industrial customs. Either way, no one denies the role alcohol played in surviving long, dark nights on the farm. It wasn't just indulgence. Sometimes it was medicine. Back in your cottage, the family sits around the table finishing up the dregs of dinner. You've passed the bottle once or twice, just small sips, enough to warm, not enough to stagger. Your brother takes a pull and coughs like he's been stabbed. Everyone laughs, even the baby who doesn't understand but laughs anyway. For a second it feels like something festive. Not a party, but a glimpse of one. In some houses, there's singing, old ballads, farm tunes, anything with a good stomp or a clap. You might join in if your fingers have thawed enough to tap the table. Or you just hum along, letting the rhythm take the edge off your sore muscles. There's no piano, no fiddle, just voices. And on the coldest nights, those voices are more comforting than a full plate. You remember stories from years past, how the neighbours once brewed plum brandy so strong it took the paint off the barn door, or how your uncle tried to distill potato liquor and ended up hallucinating that a goat was the Archbishop of Canterbury. He doesn't drink anymore. The goat still gives him strange looks. As the night wears on, you sip slower. The room's warm, not from the fire so much as the bodies packed into it. The slow pulse of shared heat and shared weariness. You feel your eyes droop, your limbs go heavy, and for the first time in days you don't feel the cold creeping up your back, you just feel still. But you also know not to drink too much. Too much makes you slow, makes you sloppy, makes you forget to check the chimney or stoke the fire, or close the henhouse gate. And winter doesn't forgive sloppiness. One slip, one spark, one open door, and you're waking up to a barn full of snow and dead chickens. You've seen it happen. So you cap the bottle, you tuck it away, you stretch, yawn, and start your slow shuffle to bed. Outside, the wind picks up again, rattling the windows and moaning across the fields like some long-forgotten hymn. Inside, you've got a little warmth in your belly, a little hum in your head, and the lingering taste of something homemade, harsh, and oddly comforting. You made it through another day. Not pretty, not easy, but you're still here, and the bottle is still half full. The nights are louder than they should be. That's the first thing you notice once the fire dims and the house settles into sleep. You lie in bed, still dressed in most of your day's layers, one foot pressed against the brick you heated earlier, and your ears start to pick up things your eyes can't see. The creak of wood shifting under the weight of frost, the soft hiss of snow falling from the eaves, and sometimes things that don't quite fit. A howl, a knock, a dragging sound you can't name. You tell yourself it's the wind. It usually is. The wind finds its way through every crack, every chimney flue, every warped board and loose latch. But there's something about this time of year. When the moon hangs low and the land is so quiet it forgets how to breathe, that makes the familiar sound wrong. You sit up, listen harder, then laugh at yourself because now even you sound like one of those old stories. Still, you go check. You always check. The door groans on its hinges as you crack it open. A blast of freezing air punches you in the face, sharp as teeth. Your lantern flickers in your hand, and there's light cast long shadows on the packed snow outside. The yard looks strange in moonlight, distorted, silvery, unfamiliar. Everything's still, except the footprints. You blink. Because yes, there are tracks, not yours, not the kids, something lighter, four-legged, rabbit, maybe, but they're too deep, too close together. You squint and follow them to the edge of the barn, then lose them in the drift. You tell yourself again, it's just an animal, but there are stories. Here's your historical fact. In the Edwardian era, many rural areas, especially those far from city centres, had no electric lighting and minimal law enforcement presence. This left nights dark and eerie, especially during winter when moonlight was often the only illumination. Folklore remained strong in these communities, with oral storytelling filling the long cold evenings. And now for the fringe delight. In parts of northern England and Scotland, it was believed that winter was the season when thin places opened. The space between the living and the dead stretched thin enough for things to slip through. People told tales of the Yule visitors, spirits, beasts, or wandering souls who would knock on doors or circle barns. To ward them off, farmers would sometimes leave a crust of bread and a splash of milk by the door, just in case. Not because they believed it, just in case. The academic debate here is ongoing. How much did superstition shape rural life during the Edwardian period? Some argue it was purely cultural, leftover beliefs from older generations that no longer held real power. Others suggest that in isolated farming communities, where life was precarious and unpredictable, superstition served as a form of psychological stability. When you had no control over the weather, the harvest, or the health of your family, telling a story gave structure to the chaos. Back inside, you bolt the door and draw the curtain. You toss another log on the fire, though it's more for comfort than warmth at this hour. The kids are asleep, curled together like puppies under layers of patchwork and wool. You sit for a moment and listen to the ticking of the old clock on the mantel, wondering how many more nights like this the season will bring. You think about the story your grandfather told, the one about the farmer who heard scratching on his barn roof every night one winter until he climbed up to check and found nothing but hoof prints leading away across the snow. Or the tale of the shepherdess who heard her own name whispered outside her window, only to wake up to find the prints of bare feet circling her home. You don't believe it, not really, except when the wind whistles just right. And it's not just ghost stories. It's wolves too, real ones, four-legged, with sharp teeth and empty bellies. You haven't seen one yet this year, but you've heard them in the woods. Distant howls, the kind that send your stomach flipping over like an overturned bucket. You check the henhouse twice a night now and you've started keeping the dog indoors. He doesn't like it. He growls at shadows. Last winter, a neighbour lost 3 sheep in one night. Found them with their throats torn and tracks circling the field like something had played with them before it killed. No one ever found out what did it. A wolf? A dog? Something worse? You don't ask anymore. You just keep the door shut and the rifle near. Because the thing about Edwardian winters is that they take more than food and firewood. They take your calm. They take your trust. And sometimes they give you nothing but fear in return. Still, tomorrow will come, same as always. You'll step outside in the grey light of dawn and these tracks will be gone or covered. Or maybe still waiting, fresh and sharp and leading somewhere you don't want to go. You finish your cup of warm milk, flavoured a dish with a splash of whatever's strongest, and sit back in your chair. The fire hisses. The shadows stay where they belong, for now. The old cat curls at your feet, tail twitching like he hears something you don't. You scratch behind his ears, eyes on the flickering flames. Outside, the wind sighs against the shutters again, and you whisper, just to yourself, "Stay out there." Stay out there, because you know better than to open the door twice in one night. The days may be shorter, but the nights feel endless, and once the sun goes down and the animals are fed, you're left with the long, slow business of passing time without freezing to death or losing your mind. It's too early to sleep, but too dark and cold to do anything useful outside, so you stay indoors, gathered close to the hearth, wrapped in whatever scraps of warmth you can find, and you sew. You don't sew because you enjoy it. You sew because your trousers are one good tug away from becoming two separate garments. You sew because your child's mittens have holes in the thumbs, and your work shirt is more patch than fabric. You sew because no one's bringing new clothes anytime soon, and even if they did, you couldn't afford them. Every stitch is a tiny declaration. We're not done yet. You sit close to the fire, squinting in the dim glow, working a bone needle through fabric so stiff with cold and use it might as well be bark. Your fingers are clumsy in the cold. The thread keeps knotting. Your back aches. But you work through it because there's nothing else to do. Your oldest daughter sits beside you, mending a sock with the patience of a priest. Across the hearth, your wife patches a blanket that's been patched a dozen times already. The little ones sleep in a heap in the corner, faces smudged with soot and dreams. Here's your historical fact. In Edwardian rural households, sewing and mending were not occasional chores but near daily rituals, especially in winter when outdoor work was limited. Clothing was passed down through siblings, then cousins, then eventually cut into strips for quilts or rags. Tailoring skills were common among women and older girls, and even the men could darn a sock or patch a coat when necessary. And a weird little fringe fact? Some Edwardian women believed that sewing by firelight infused the garment with domestic luck, a sort of spiritual warmth sewn into the seams. Others took care not to sew after sunset on certain days of the month, fearing it would bring illness or marital discord. Superstition or not, you've certainly noticed that your mending tends to fall apart faster when done on a Monday. Or maybe that's just your hands giving up. There's a debate among historians about just how labour-intensive rural domestic life was compared to urban working-class life. Some argue that despite back-breaking farm labour, country women had slightly more control over their time and tasks than factory workers in the cities. Others counter that rural women worked longer hours overall, up at dawn, tending children, managing animals, preserving food, sewing, laundrying, and sometimes even ploughing fields. The truth? It's hard to measure. But anyone who's ever spent 5 hours reattaching buttons by candlelight knows that domestic work wasn't a break. It was just a different kind of hard. Back in your cottage, the fire crackles low, the flame casts shadows over your needlework, bouncing over threadbare knees and elbows that have seen too many winters. You bite the thread with your teeth, because you lost your scissors again, or maybe they were borrowed and never returned, and give the fabric a final tug. Good enough, it has to be. You lean back, rubbing your eyes. The smoke stings, the air is heavy with the scent of wool, coal and whatever stew boiled over on the hearth earlier. There's not much sound, just the gentle rhythm of thread pulling through cloth and the occasional snore from the dog curled beneath the table. You hear the wind trying to get in through the cracks again, but it's muffled now, dulled by thick curtains and old blankets tacked to the windows. You've built yourself a little pocket of warmth in a sea of ice. Someone starts humming, an old song you haven't heard in years, the kind that makes you feel homesick for something you can't quite name. The little girl beside you picks it up and hums along, off-key but sweet. You smile without looking up. Later, when the sewing's done and your fingers are too sore to hold the needle straight, you roll up the mended clothes and stack them near the hearth to stay warm. They'll go on first thing in the morning, still warm if you're lucky, or at least not frozen. You glance at the pile and nod. Another small victory. The nights are long, yes, but they're not silent. They're filled with the soft click of needles, the whisper of fabric, the murmur of tired voices talking about nothing in particular. Someone recounts the story of when Uncle Bert patched his trousers so badly, he sewed the backseat shut and didn't notice until he tried to sit. Everyone laughs, loud and real, not just polite chuckles. The kind of laugh that buys you another half hour of warmth. You take another brick from the hearth, wrap it in rags, and tuck it into the foot of the bed. Your daughter places the patched socks on the stool to dry. The fire is low now, just embers, but it's enough. It has to be. Tomorrow another elbow will burst through a shirt, another hem will unravel. Another pair of gloves will vanish into the straw of the barn, never to return, but tonight everything that needs to be sewn is sewn. You lie down stiff and cold and already dreading the morning, but your coat won't fall off your shoulders. and your trousers will stay up, and for now, that's enough. You pull the blanket over your head, close your eyes and dream, not of sunshine or green fields, but of thread that never tangles, and needles that don't bend, and boots that never wear through. You don't think much about your teeth until one of them starts to hurt. Then it becomes the only thing you can think about. It begins as a dull ache, a low throb behind your molar, easy to ignore when you're busy splitting logs or chasing pigs. But by the third day, the pain sharpens. By the fifth, it's crawling up the side of your skull. By the seventh, you're ready to rip the thing out with a rusty spoon if it means peace. The cold makes it worse, and it always does. Every breath of winter air seems to press against your face like a hammer. You try holding your hand over your cheek. You chew only on the other side. You swirl hot tea in your mouth and pretend it helps. But it's still there, that deep, nerve-aching, sleep-stealing misery that only gets worse at night, when the house is quiet and you're left alone with it. There is no dentist, not out here. The village barber used to do extractions, but he lost a few too many customers to infection, and now he just sticks to haircuts and gossip. The doctor comes through twice a month maybe, and he's more likely to prescribe laudanum than actually touch your mouth. Besides, you can't afford his fee. So what you've got is time, stubbornness, and a handful of dubious home remedies passed down from people who apparently had stronger stomachs than sense. Here's your historical fact. In Edwardian rural England, dental care was practically non-existent for most farming families. Toothbrushes were a luxury, toothpaste was often homemade, and extractions were done at home using pliers, nails, or anything else that could get leverage. Infection was a constant risk, and many adults lost most of their teeth by middle age. Your fringe fact for the night? One folk cure for toothache involved heating a knitting needle in the fire until red hot and pressing it against the cheek to burn the pain out. Another called for holding a clove of garlic in your mouth until the pain stopped, or until you passed out from the taste. And if all else failed, people would chew tobacco or spirit-soaked rags to numb the gum, then yank the tooth themselves. You've heard someone suggest tying a string to the tooth and the other end to a slamming door. You didn't laugh. So now you're sitting at the kitchen table, in the quiet gloom of late evening, with a bottle of your strongest cider in one hand and a pair of pliers in the other. They're not clean. They're the same pliers you use to fix the fence and pull nails from old boots. But you've boiled them. You've wiped them down with a rag soaked in liquor. You've stared at them long enough to stop shaking. Someone's holding a lantern. Someone else is gripping your shoulder, maybe too tightly. You wish they wouldn't look at you like that. Like this is something brave. Like this is some kind of act of courage. It's not. You're not a hero. You're a farmer with a rotting tooth, and it's not even you doing the pulling. No, that's Thomas. The neighbour who swears up and down that he's done this before, though you're fairly certain his only credential is having once removed a splinter from his wife's heel without screaming. He's got his sleeves rolled up and a look of grim resolve that makes you regret asking. Ready? He asks. You nod. You're absolutely not ready. The first tug is just exploratory, testing the grip, seeing if the pliers will hold. They do, too well. You feel the metal press into your gum, and for a moment you see stars. Your legs kick against the table leg, someone hisses, someone else mutters a prayer. Thomas yanks harder. It doesn't come out clean. Of course it doesn't. It never does. There's a tearing sensation, wet and wrong, and suddenly your mouth is full of blood. You don't remember the sound you made, but someone says later it scared the dog so badly he ran out into the snow and didn't come back until morning. You spit into a tin cup and watch the blood swirl like ink in water. The tooth, what's left of it, sits on the table like a pale little corpse. You think about keeping it. You don't. You tip the cider bottle into your mouth and take a long pull, even though it burns like fire on your raw gums. Now comes the real test, infection. If you're lucky, the bleeding stops and the hole scabs over and you go back to chewing on one side for the rest of winter. If you're not, well, you've already made a mental note of where the nearest spade is and which part of the garden has the softest soil. Here's the scholarly debate. Were Edwardian farmers really tougher, or were they just out of options? Some say they endured more pain because they had to, because there was no one coming to save them. Others argue they weren't tougher, just quieter about suffering, that they bore it the way they bore every other hardship, with silence, with grit, and with a bottle close at hand. You would like to think you're tough, but truthfully, you're just tired. Later that night, you lie in bed with a rag pressed to your cheek and your mouth throbbing like it's trying to beat its way out of your skull. Someone brings you soup, lukewarm and thin, but you're grateful. You manage 3 spoonfuls before giving up. Your tongue feels too big. Your lips sting. The bleeding's slowed at least. Outside, the wind howls again. That mournful sound you're starting to think is less weather and more something with a sense of humour. Your jaw pulses in time with it. You close your eyes and try to imagine what it might feel like to eat something crunchy again. An apple, a crust of bread, a boiled sweet, anything. But for now, you fold rest. The tooth's gone. You're still here. It starts with snow. Not flakes, not drifts. Walls. You open the door one morning and instead of a grey sky and the usual teeth-chattering wind, there's a blank wall of white. You push against it and it resists like a stubborn animal. The world's gone silent. Not peaceful, not serene, trapped. The blizzard rolled in overnight, fast and thick, and now you're sealed in like a jar of jam. Buried alive in your own home with only root vegetables, sour milk and whatever fuel's left in the bin. No one's going anywhere today. You shut the door carefully, like it might explode back open and bury the kitchen. The kids are quiet. The animals will have to wait. They're safe in the barn for now, but the drift's already piled up past the windows, and by nightfall the roof might go under too. You can barely see through the glass panes, crusted over with frost and blown snow. The sky's still snowing even though the world's already white. Everything feels slow, muffled, like time has caught a chill and decided to lie down. Here's your historical fact. Blizzards and heavy snowstorms were one of the most feared aspects of Edwardian farming life. With no modern weather forecasts and very little infrastructure for snow removal, sudden storms could cut off entire families for days or even weeks. Travel became impossible. Mail stopped. Food deliveries ceased. If your stores weren't full by December, your odds in January weren't great. And here's your fringe fact. Some families would hang a horseshoe over the main door, not for luck, but for navigation. If they had to leave the house during a whiteout, they'd tie a rope to the doorframe and feel for the horseshoe as they returned, like a sailor gripping the rail in a storm. No one wanted to lose someone to snow blindness or poor footing just 10 feet from home. Now, let's dip into the scholarly disagreement. Just how isolated were rural households in winter? Some historians argue that most families had strong community links and frequent visits between farms to share news and supplies. Others claim that when weather turned severe, isolation was nearly absolute. Some homes might not see another human being for weeks. Letters went undelivered. Neighbours were only reachable by risky, hours-long treks across frozen fields. And if something went wrong, illness, injury, childbirth, you were on your own. Back in your cottage, you check the pantry again even though you already know what's in there. The same shrivelling potatoes, the same sack of oats, the same last onion that's trying to sprout. No fresh bread, no butter, no meat. The cellar's damp and sour smelling, and the mice have returned. Bold and lazy now that they know you can't leave to set more traps. You sigh and wrap your coat tighter. There's work to be done indoors, sure. Always is. You mend the broom, patch the boot soles again, wipe down the windows to let in what little light you can. You read from an old almanac just to give your brain something to chew on. The children play cards on the floor until they start fighting. Then they sit in the corner, arms crossed, watching the snow fall sideways through the kitchen window, like it's daring them to step outside. You try to send a letter. Not to town, just to a neighbour 2 farms over. Mrs. Ellis, who always has herbs for coughs, and once made a whole stew out of cabbage cores and lard. You write slowly, careful with your spelling, and when you're done, you stare at it, knowing no one's coming to collect it. Not today, probably not this week. The letter sits on the shelf like a trapped bird. Evening comes fast. The light outside turns the same colour as old pewter, and that fire can't chase the chill from the corners. You gather everyone close, kids, dog, anyone near with the warm blood, and make a space near the hearth. It's too early for sleep, too late for anything else. You boil water for tea and use the last of the dried mint. You soak your feet in a basin while your youngest curls beside you, already nodding off. You think about stories you've heard, of blizzards so fierce they froze chickens solid in the coop, of families found in spring still huddled together by cold hearths, snowdrifts up to the second floor, faces frozen like wax figures. You tell yourself you'll never let it get that bad. You've still got firewood. You've still got food. You've still got each other. But then the candle flickers, and the wind of outside howls again, not in a gentle moan, but a scream high and hollow. You go still, everyone does. For a second it sounds like a voice, then it's just wind again. You light another candle, just in case. You fall asleep in your chair, not quite intending to, one boot still on, a mug in your lap and a blanket half pulled across your shoulders. You dream of walking through endless white snow up to your waist, calling out to someone you can't quite see. When you wake, the mug's cold, the fire's low, and your feet have gone numb. The snow hasn't stopped. It's piled higher than yesterday. You open the door again to test the drift, and this time it slides inward a little, scattering powder onto the floor. You shut it again. You mutter something not fit for church. The storm doesn't care, and neither does the calendar. You glance at it on the wall, still showing December, though it's halfway through January now. The pencil line you drew to mark New Year's Day feels like a joke. You pick up a pen, cross off another day, then you look out the window and whisper, "Come on then. Do your worst, because what else can you say?" Water stops being a convenience in winter. It becomes a project, a hazard, a kind of minor obsession. When the first cold snap hit back in December, you told yourself it was fine. The pump would hold, the well wouldn't freeze, and you'd just be smart about how much you used. Then January arrived like a hammer, and by the time you went out one morning and found the handle stuck fast with ice, you knew you were in for it. Now, every drop you draw is a battle. The hand pump mounted just beside the barn has to be primed with hot water first, boiled inside, then carried out in a cracked kettle, wrapped in an old sock to stop it freezing before it reaches the spout. You pour it down the pump throat like an offering, then lean into the handle with stiff arms and hope the frost hasn't crept in too far. Most mornings it takes a dozen tries before anything happens, a groan, a squeak, then finally the slow, blessed gurgle of water forcing its way up from the dark. You fill the buckets fast, because the moment that water hits the cold air it starts to turn. You've seen steam rise from the surface and freeze mid-drift. Once you watched an ice ring form inside the bucket before you even made it halfway to the door. That's when you learn to bring the buckets in first and fill them at the pump, not the other way around. Every step between pump and porch is a race against the weather. Here's your historical fact. In Edwardian rural Britain, most homes still relied on wells or manual pumps for their water supply. These would often freeze in winter unless carefully maintained or insulated. Water had to be heated indoors for everything from washing to cooking to laundry, and many homes rationed it strictly during severe cold spells, knowing that losing the pump to ice could cripple the household. Now, for your fringe fact, some farmers, desperate to keep the pipes or pump mechanisms from freezing, would pack old horse blankets or the sheep wool around the base, even lighting small fires beside them at night and smothering the flames with ash come dawn. It worked, sometimes. Other times the blanket froze solid, and you ended up with a pump wrapped in a useless chunk of ice-covered fabric and the faint smell of scorched wool. And here's a little academic quarrel still rattling around in historical circles. Just how effective were homemade plumbing hacks in preventing freeze-ups? Diaries and oral histories are full of clever tricks, wrapping pipes with hay, pouring salt water into joints, or using lanterns inside small pump houses. But there's debate about whether these were genuinely useful or more of a placebo to keep people from panicking. Some historians suggest most homes simply lived with long, dry days and found ways to make do. Back inside, the water you manage to collect gets used fast, a little for cooking, a little for tea, some for the animals. The rest, saved, guarded. You pour it into buckets and keep them near the fire, knowing full well they'll still ice over by morning. You chip the top layer with a ladle when you need it. You rinse your hands and watch the water bead on your skin and freeze if you stand still too long. Bathing? You gave up on that weeks ago. Everyone smells like smoke, wet wool, and whatever they last touched. Cows, bacon grease, sour milk. You try not to notice. The laundry's frozen on the line anyway. You brought in one shirt the other day and it stood upright on its own like a starched corpse. Once, a pipe burst under the kitchen. It wasn't even a proper pipe, just a length of tin someone had tacked into place years ago. You didn't notice until water started pooling beneath the floorboards and then freezing into ripples that made the boards buckle. You spent 3 days digging out the trench with a pickaxe, teeth clenched, breath fogging the air like a furnace. The fix? A piece of leather from an old belt, some cloth and a prayer. Still holding, surprisingly. The worst is when the well freezes. Not the pump, the actual well. It doesn't happen often, but when it does, the panic is real. You dream of it sometimes, that dull thud of the bucket hitting something solid instead of water. You lower the line again and again, each time hoping for the splash that never comes, just the hollow knock of ice like a door slamming shut beneath the earth. When that happens, your options vanish quick. You melt snow, you collect rain, you ration every drop like it's coin. That's what today is. Snow melting day. You fill every pot you own, every basin, bucket and kettle, with packed snow from the yard and bring it into thaw near the fire. It's slow, miserable work, and the return is pitiful. 10 scoops of snow become a cup of water. The children ask if they can eat some, and you say no, half out of worry, half out of spite. There's a rhythm to it though. Melt, collect, pour, back outside for more. You get good at identifying clean snow, none from the barn roof, nothing yellow, thank you very much. You pack it tight, wedge it into a pot and wait. The room smells faintly of wet air and soot. You hope the fire holds. Later that night, as you lift a basin of lukewarm meltwater to rinse your face, you catch sight of yourself in the cracked mirror above the sink. You look like someone who's been punching snow. Your cheeks are windburned, your hands cracked, your eyes red-rimmed from smoke and cold. But your face is clean. Not warm, not fresh, just clean. And somehow that feels like a win. Tomorrow the pump might thaw, or it might not. Maybe the well will break. Maybe the whole farm will freeze into one giant snow globe that no one bothers to shake. But tonight, you've got 2 buckets of water left, a pile of wet towels steaming by the hearth, and the sound of dripping as snow becomes something useful. It's not much, but it's more than ice. You can only do so much alone. That's the quiet truth winter teaches you over and over in its slow, cruel way. You might think you can tough it out by yourself, stack the wood, chop the ice, cook the meals, patch the roof, keep the fire going, keep your head right. But by the 3rd week of storms, when the snow's shoulder high and you've eaten your way down to the shriveled carrots and rock-hard bread crusts, you realise you need other people. Not want, not prefer, need. So you bundle up, you slap your boots against the wall to knock the ice off. You wrap your scarf so tight around your neck you can barely breathe, and you head out toward the neighbour's place, half for company, half for survival, and maybe just to prove the world still exists beyond your gate. The walk isn't easy. The snow is deep, uneven, crusted in places and slush in others. You curse with every step, but when you see smoke curling from someone else's chimney, a light flickering in someone else's kitchen window, you feel something soften in your chest. You're not alone in this icebox after all. That's the way it works out here. In the cities, people stack themselves up in buildings and complain about the cold to strangers on trolleys. But on the farms, winter makes people lean in. It becomes an unspoken pact. You help me, I help you, not because of charity, because of necessity. Here's your historical fact. During the Edwardian period, rural communities relied heavily on seasonal cooperation, especially in winter. Neighbouring families would share food stores, tools, warm spaces, and labour. It was common to hold communal events in barns or churches, not just for religious reasons, but to maintain social bonds and pool resources during long, isolating months. And your delightful fringe fact? In parts of Yorkshire and Cumbria, it was traditional to host midwinter parkin nights, gatherings where families would bring oatcake or gingerbread, light lanterns, and tell ghost stories in the barn to distract from the cold. Some even staged impromptu performances or songs, turning hunger and hardship into a kind of reluctant celebration. Not quite Christmas, not quite a party, just an excuse to be together and warm for a while. Now the scholarly wrinkle. Some historians romanticize these winter gatherings as evidence of tight-knit, self-sufficient communities. Others argue that they were born more from desperation than tradition, with many families reluctant to ask for help unless they were truly at the brink. But the result was the same: mutual aid, shared burden, and the slow knitting together of winter-worn lives. Back in the present, you knock on the neighbour's door with frozen knuckles and a sheepish smile. They let you in like they've been expecting you. They always do. You bring a jar of lard and half a turnip pie, what you could spare. They offer tea, warm and smoky, brewed strong with a few crushed bay leaves, because that's all anyone has left. You sit close to their hearth, trading news and strees while your fingers remember what it feels like not to ache. Someone jokes about the storm, that it'll last until Easter, or maybe until the king abdicates. Laughter bubbles up, the kind that doesn't fix anything but makes it all feel lighter anyway. You take your boots off and stretch your toes toward the fire. They burn from thawing, but it's a good kind of pain. Later, when the conversation slows, someone pulls out a deck of cards. The edges are soft, the ink faded, but the games still work. You lose 3 hands of rummy and win 1 of snap. The baby of the house toddles over and hands you a biscuit so dry it could be used to patch walls. You eat it with exaggerated delight. They laugh. You laugh. The visit stretches longer than it should. You promise to go after an hour, then after one more hand. Then after the kettle's empty. By the time you pull your boots back on, the sky outside is lavender with early dusk. They insist you take something with you. A wedge of hard cheese, a handful of oats, a length of twine you mentioned needing. You resist, not too hard. You pocket them with thanks. The walk home feels shorter. Maybe it's the tea, maybe it's the cheese, maybe it's just that you're not walking into silence now. You're carrying the echo of voices, the memory of firelight dancing on other people's walls. Back in your own cottage, your family asks if the world's still turning out there. You tell them yes. You tell them the neighbour's cow is about to calve, that someone heard a fox in the lane, that the cheese is a bit salty but not bad with bread. You sit around your own hearth and share the small news like it's gold. Because it is. This is how the edges are held together. Threaded with talk, warmed with presence. Later that week, you host in return. You sweep the hearth, boil up a pot of whatever's left, and pack the cracks in the windows with rags to keep the cold at bay. They arrive with a tin of biscuits, a jug of something they swear is cordial, and the same deck of cards. You sing. You stomp your feet in rhythm. Someone tells the ghost story about the farmer who married a snow spirit and melted her by mistake. Everyone pretends not to shiver. The cold doesn't vanish, the snow doesn't melt. But for one night, it feels like winter loses its grip. Not because the temperature changes, because someone else is sitting beside you, because the room smells like laughter instead of wood smoke, because the fire burns hotter when more people are near. And when they leave, late and bundled, you stand in the doorway and watch their lantern bob away into the dark. You wave. They wave back. You go inside. And for the first time in days, the silence doesn't feel so heavy. You wake up with a rattle in your chest, not a polite one. This is the kind of cough that shakes the bed frame and tastes like iron. Your lungs burn, your throat feels like sandpaper soaked in vinegar, and your whole body aches like you spent the night wrestling a mule. You're not surprised. It was only a matter of time. You've watched it pass through the household one by one, first to the youngest, then the middle boy, then your spouse, who insisted it was just a chill. Now it's your turn, and winter is ready to have a laugh. You drag yourself out of bed wrapped in the patchwork blanket you slept in. You don't even bother with your coat. There's no time. You shuffle to the hearth and stir the coals back to life, wincing every time you breathe in. It's too early for the fire to be out, and too late for your joints to forgive you for kneeling. Still, you pile kindling and whisper to the flame like it's an old friend who's starting to forget your name. Eventually it catches. You collapse into the nearest chair and close your eyes. There is no doctor. Not unless you want to walk 6 miles to the village and wait 3 days for him to come round, and you'd have to afford it too, which is hilarious. What you do have is a shelf of jars, half labelled and half mysterious, filled with remedies passed down through the generations. Most of them taste like regret and burn worse than the illness. You start digging through them now, coughing so hard your ribs hurt. Here's your historical fact. In Edwardian England, especially in rural farming communities, medical care was scarce, and folk medicine remained the first and often only line of defence against illness. Coughs, colds, fevers and chest infections were treated with home remedies made from herbs, roots, spices, alcohol and animal fats. Professional medical attention was a last resort and often unaffordable for working families. Your fringe fact? One common remedy for winter cough was a poultice made of mashed onions, mustard seed and goose fat, wrapped in linen and strapped to the chest overnight. Another involved boiling horse chestnuts in milk and drinking the strained liquid before bed. Some swore by a concoction of honey, garlic, vinegar and soot scraped from the inside of the stovepipe. You're not sure which one you're more afraid of. The scholarly debate here is as wheezy as the patients themselves. Were these remedies effective or just desperate rituals? Some argue that the antibacterial properties of ingredients like garlic and honey provided legitimate benefit. Others suggest it was more about routine and comfort, making people feel like they were fighting back against the helplessness of winter illness. As always, the truth probably lives somewhere in the middle, in a sticky, stinky poultice slapped onto someone's chest at midnight. You finally find the jar you're looking for, dried elderflower, mixed with licorice root, and something your grandmother used to call lung leaf. You're not entirely sure what plant that was, but she lived to 90, so you trust her judgment. You boil it in a chipped enamel pot, adding a spoonful of honey, real honey, not the beet syrup substitute. You can't waste it, but you also can't breathe, so you figure it's a fair trade. The tea is bitter. It tastes like something between tree bark and a burnt pancake. But it warms you, and after the second cup the coughing calms. Not gone, just muted. Like the sickness knows it's not going to win today, but it's already scheduled a rematch. You rub a bit of goose grease onto your chest, as much for warmth as anything else. The smell hits you like a punch in the face. Greasy animal, slightly sour. But it starts to seep into your skin, and your breath eases a little. You throw an old scarf around your neck, sip more of the tea, and huddle near the fire like a house cat that's seen too much. Outside, the sky is white again. Not snowy, just white. You've stopped asking the weather for favours. You're not even sure what month it is anymore. January probably, though you wouldn't put money on it. One of the kids coughs in the next room. A different kind of cough, high-pitched and rattly. You know it by sound now. You call to them softly, your voice rough as gravel, and they shuffle into the kitchen wrapped in a blanket like a ghost. You pour them a mug of the same tea. They don't like it. You don't care. They drink it anyway. Later in the day, you venture out to the barn. You have to. The animals need feeding, and no one else is strong enough today. The wind cuts into your lungs like knives, and you double over twice before you even reach the gate. But you make it. You always do. Inside, the cows shift and snort. Their breath hangs in the air like ghosts. One of them moos softly, as if asking if you're all right. You lean against her side for warmth and pretend she's asking because she cares. The rest of the day is a blur. More tea, more coughing, more naps in front of the hearth that don't feel like rest. The house is quiet in the way sick houses always are. A little too still, a little too heavy. You keep checking the children's faces for fever. You keep checking your own breath for blood. You fall asleep in the rocker just after dusk, one hand still holding the mug. You dream of swimming through steam, of drowning in goose fat, of your grandmother shaking her head and muttering that you brewed the tea wrong. You wake up sweating and freezing at the same time, and still coughing, but still here. Death is part of winter. Everyone knows it. No one talks about it until they have to. You feel it when you walk into the barn and something's too quiet, when you glance toward the coop and notice fewer footprints in the snow, when you lay a hand on the child's forehead in the middle of the night and realise the fever's gone, but so has the warmth. It's not always dramatic. There's no thunderclap, just stillness. An awful, final stillness that presses against the walls and stays there long after the fire burns out. This time it's Old Man Hearn, from the farm up the lane. He'd been coughing since December. Everyone knew he wasn't strong enough to make it through the season, but he kept chopping wood with a tremble in his hands, kept tending to the pigs like the snow wasn't icing over his boots, kept swearing that spring would come if he just fed it enough hay and stubbornness. You admired him for that. Everyone did. But when his front chimney stopped smoking for 2 days in a row, someone had to check. You drew the short straw, so you trudge across the white fields in the early morning cold, boots creaking, snow crunching beneath you with the sound of bones snapping underfoot. The sky is a blank grey sheet, and the wind moves like it's lost something. You knock on his door once, twice, 3 times. No answer. The handle is frozen. You brace your shoulder and force it open. The smell hits first. Cold doesn't hide everything. Then the silence. That awful kind of hush that settles when something is already gone and the house is just waiting for someone to notice. He's in his chair, fire out. Blanket half slipped to the floor. Eyes closed, hands folded in his lap like he knew it was coming and figured he'd greet it sitting down. A pot of tea, long frozen, sits cracked on the stove. You stand in the doorway for a long time, hat in your hands, not sure what to do next. You've never seen a man so clearly not suffering anymore. Here's your historical fact. In rural Edwardian England, winter deaths were common, especially among the elderly, the very young, and the sick. With limited access to medical care, harsh living conditions, and poor nutrition, families often lost members each season. Death registration was required, but burials were sometimes delayed for weeks if the ground was too frozen to dig. And the eerie fringe fact. It was a common belief in certain counties that a fire left untended at the time of death would draw the soul out too fast, leaving it unsettled. Some would relight the hearth immediately after discovering a body, to warm the spirit and ease its journey to the other side. Others placed a warm loaf of bread on the chest, to weigh down the soul, they said, so it doesn't wander. The debate among scholars? Whether rural death practices of the time were rooted in practical necessity or persistent superstition. Was the tradition of keeping a candle by the body an act of faith, or just a way to keep away rats? Was washing the dead with herbs a religious ritual or a sanitation tactic? The lines blur, especially in communities where belief and practicality often walked hand in hand, out of sheer necessity. Back in Hearn's house, you light the stove, out of respect, out of instinct. The flames cough to life, the shadows shift. You don't speak, you just sit a while. You know what comes next. You walk back to your place, your breath jagged, your thoughts half frozen, and you fetch the spade. The ground's hard as rock, but you've dug in worse. A few neighbours come to help. No one says much, just a nod. A quiet, grim rhythm of labour begins. Steel on dirt, ice flying up in frozen chunks, gloves stiff with effort and grief. You build the box yourself, pine simple. He would have liked it that way. You wrap him in his best coat, stuff a pair of wool socks into the corners for good measure. Someone says a few words at the burial, nothing long, just enough to mark the passing. His pigs grunt in the background. His dog watches from the doorstep, waiting for a door that won't open again. You spend the rest of the day thinking about your own hearth, your own family, what they'd do if the fire went out and didn't come back. You add extra wood to the stack near the door. You check the blankets for holes. You sharpen your shovel. The children ask what happened. You tell them gently. You don't say it was peaceful. You say it was quiet. They nod like they understand, even if they don't. You show them how to mend the gloves again, just in case. That night, the fire burns hotter than usual. Not because it's colder, just because you need it to. You sit in the chair, much like Hearn's, and hold your mug with both hands, staring into the flames like you're trying to read the future in the coals. Someone plays a song softly, an old one, half forgotten. No one sings, but everyone listens, and in the morning you rise early, dress slow and check the sky. Still winter, still cruel, but you're still breathing. And today that's enough. It just sneaks up on you. Not the cold, not the hunger, not even the grief. The boredom, the sheer grinding monotony of being trapped in the same four walls day after frozen day. You thought you were tough enough to handle winter, and in all the ways that matter, you are. But no one ever warned you about how long it would feel. Not in your body always has work, but in your mind. Your thoughts have started looping like old news, bouncing off the rafters, going nowhere. You chop the wood, you feed the animals, you boil the porridge, you mend the socks. Again and again and again, every task is the same as yesterday. Every conversation ends with, "We'll see come spring." You've heard the same story about the pig that broke through the fence so many times you could recite it backward while blindfolded and half asleep. Sometimes you dream about walking in a straight line until the snow turns into grass. Cabin fever, they call it. Though that makes it sound quaint. This feels more like your brain is rattling around inside a freezing tin can. Even the dog is sick of you. He stares at the door, sighs dramatically, then goes back to chewing the same bone he's been working on since Boxing Day. You try to keep yourself occupied. You fix tools that don't need fixing. You carve little shapes into the handles of spoons. You sweep floors that are already clean. You write a letter to someone in town even though there's no mail delivery until the thaw. You catch yourself talking to the teapot like it's a friend, and then laugh too hard, too loud, and scare the youngest, who now probably thinks you're losing it. Here's your historical fact. During the Edwardian era, especially in remote rural areas, isolation during winter was a well-documented psychological burden. Long stretches without the travel or social visits left many families mentally strained. There are accounts of melancholia, restless nerves, and even brief episodes of hysteria or hallucination, particularly in households with little sunlight and minimal intellectual stimulation. And your slightly unhinged fringe fact. Some households kept logs not just for firewood but to talk to. Yes, literal talking logs. Folks would carve faces into them and place them near the hearth. Not as toys, not for kids, for company. You've never carved eyes into a log. Yet. But the way things are going, you wouldn't rule it out. And here's the scholarly conversation still clanking along like a frostbitten wagon. Was winter mental strain seen as illness, or just life? Some argue rural folk didn't have time to be depressed. The work was constant and idleness was frowned upon. Others suggest that depression and mental fatigue were simply folded into daily life, masked by routine and left untreated, until spring came and people felt like themselves again. The line between tired and not quite right was blurry at best. Back in your world, you finally give up on the chores and go outside, not for anything urgent, just to feel the sky over your head. The snow squeaks under your boots like it's annoyed you're walking on it again. You tramp in circles around the barn. 5 laps, 10 laps, 20. The cold bites your cheeks and burns your lungs, but you keep moving. You count fence posts. You try to remember what your own handwriting looks like. You squint up at the sky and wonder how something can be that pale and still feel so heavy. You try not to look toward the road. There's nothing there. No visitors, no deliveries, no surprise telegrams. Just white, endless, crushing white. When you come back in, your boots leave a trail across the floor. You wipe it away with a sigh. You sit by the fire. You stare at the kettle. Again. The steam twists like it's dancing just to keep itself entertained. You almost envy it. Later, the kids start getting testy. They've been inside too long, too. The board games are worn, the books read twice through, and the youngest just tried to use the broom as a jousting lance. You separate them, gently, and then suggest, half-joking, a house-wide game of hide-and-seek. To your surprise, they cheer. You close your eyes, count to 100, and spend the next hour pretending you can't see their socked feet sticking out from under furniture. You let them win. Of course you do. By nightfall, the mood is better. Someone sings while stirring the evening pot. The youngest draws on the frost-covered window pane with one warm finger. Little houses, stick figures, a sun that doesn't exist yet. You draw one beside it, without saying anything. It's crooked, but they smile. You sit by the fire that night and finally write something for yourself. A scrap of thought in an old notebook. Nothing important, just a line. Today was grey, but not as heavy as yesterday. You stare at it for a while. It feels like progress. Before bed, you find yourself patting the wall beside the hearth like it's an old friend. You realise this is the longest you've ever gone without seeing anyone from outside your own family. The silence isn't loud anymore. It's just always there like an extra coat. You wrap the blankets tight, press your forehead to the warm brick at the foot of the bed, and try to picture green fields. You can't. Not yet. But you remember the sound the grass makes when it moves in wind. That's something. Tomorrow maybe you'll carve a spoon handle into a horse, or a ship, or a friend. The knock comes just after sundown. 2 quick raps, nothing threatening, but sharp enough to cut through the hiss of the wind and the soft clatter of spoons in soup bowls. Everyone freezes. The dog lifts his head but doesn't bark, which makes it worse somehow. You exchange glances across the table. No one's expected. No one's coming in this weather. But there it is again, a third knock. Not louder, not rushed. Just firm, like whoever's out there knows they'll be let in, or doesn't care if they are. You stand, wrapping your shawl tighter. The door groans on its hinges, and the snow rushes in like it's been waiting. There's a man there, or maybe a boy. It's hard to tell through the layers of rags and ice on his coat. His boots are soaked through, his beard patchy, eyes sunken but sharp. He doesn't say much, just, "Evening? You've got a barn, don't you?" You hesitate because hospitality is one thing and caution is another, but he doesn't look dangerous. He looks tired. You've seen that look in your own reflection too many times this winter to miss it in someone else. You nod, you jerk your head toward the barn and hand him half a loaf of bread without asking if he's eaten. He thanks you without meeting your eye. Here's your historical fact. During the Edwardian era, itinerant labourers, called tramps, hobos or wayfarers, were a common sight across rural England, especially in winter. Many had been displaced by industrial shifts, family tragedies, or simply born into poverty. While some towns had workhouses, many men preferred to stay on the move, relying on the kindness or tolerance of farmers who could offer food, work, or just a dry spot in the barn. And your fringe detail. There was an unspoken code among travelling workers. A chalk mark on a fence post or stone near the gate could signal what kind of welcome awaited inside. A circle might mean safe to ask for food. A cross could mean work offered. A slash through a square. Stay away. Farmers often knew these symbols were there but said nothing. In the cold, survival had its own silent language. Now for the scholarly debate. Were these winter wanderers seen as threats or part of the fabric of rural life? Some historians argue they were viewed with suspicion, blamed for thefts and accused of bringing disease. Others note that many farming families had once relied on such transient labour themselves and saw the presence of a tramp at the door as a seasonal inevitability, just another soul trying to make it through. Either way, they left behind few written records, but countless stories. You don't see him again that night. After dinner, you slip on your boots and walk out to the barn with a lantern, half expecting him to be gone already. But he's still there, curled up in the hay, head resting on his pack. He stands when you enter, not afraid, just respectful. You hand him an old quilt, some dry socks, and a jar of something pickled that might have once been edible. You don't talk much. You're both too tired. He says his name is Arthur, or maybe Albert. You don't quite catch it, and he doesn't repeat it. He says he's been walking east for 2 weeks, that he worked horses before the war, that he picked hops last season, but the frost came early. He says the town's full, the workhouse is full, that last barn he slept in had rats the size of chickens. He smiles like he knows how absurd it sounds. You laugh because you do too. The next morning he's already up, sweeping out the barn with your spare broom. No one asked him to. He just started. When you bring him a mug of tea, he thanks you with a kind of care that feels older than he is. You offer him a day's work, mending fences. If his hands are steady, he accepts without hesitation. He stays 3 days, never quite inside the house, but not quite outside either. He eats with the family at the table that sleeps in the hay. He fixes the gate that's been dragging since November. He splits enough kindling to last a week. The dog takes a liking to him, and your youngest follows him around the yard like a shadow. On the 4th morning he's gone. No goodbye. No note. Just the broom leaned against the wall, the quilt folded, and the jar returned. Cleaned out, washed, and upside down to dry. You find a small carving tucked into the wood of the barn door, low and neat. A triangle with a dot in the centre. You don't know what it means, but it feels like a thank you. You tell the children he had to go find work, that he's moving on like people do, but you know deep down that winter's not done yet. And neither is he. He'll knock on another door tomorrow, tell another half-truth about where he's from, sweep someone else's barn, fix another fence. You catch yourself looking out the window more often that week, listening for the knock, not expecting it. Just ready. Later that evening, as you sweep the hearth, you find a button on the floor. Small, plain bone. It must have fallen from his coat. You hold it in your palm for a long time before tucking it into the drawer where you keep string, bent nails, and coins too old to spend, just in case he ever comes back for it. It happens overnight, just like it always does. A lie of a thaw. You step outside in the early morning, still bracing for the bite of wind on your cheeks, and instead, the air wraps around you like a lukewarm cloth. Damp, heavy, unsettling. The snow underfoot isn't powder anymore. It crunches wet and collapses slightly, like a cake that's been taken out of the oven too soon. For a moment you just stand there, blinking at the sky, suspicious of the warmth. Because this isn't spring, you know better. This is a trick. You feel it in your bones, the same way the animals do. The hens are louder this morning, clucking like they've just remembered their birds and not feathered bricks. The dog keeps sniffing the air, tail up, unsure whether to be excited or deeply offended. Even the cows look confused, shifting in their stalls and steam rising off their hides in thick clouds as they twitch their ears and blink into the watery light filtering through the barn windows. The sun shows up for once, soft and yellow, like it's testing the waters. The icicles hanging off the eaves start to drip, a slow rhythmic patter that feels louder than it should in the quiet. You watch water slide off the roof, carving little trenches through the packed snow around the yard, pooling into slick puddles that freeze again the second the sun ducks behind a cloud. It's like watching the land breathe for the first time in weeks, and then cough. Here's your historical fact. Sudden midwinter thaws were common in Edwardian Britain, often brought on by brief shifts in Atlantic weather systems. These thaws were sometimes welcome but more often feared, especially by rural farmers, because the temporary warmth softened the ground and weakened ice, only for the deep freeze to return within days or even hours, causing structural damage, animal illness, and dangerous flooding. And the strange little fringe belief tied to this, some rural folk called this false spring the devil's breath. The idea was that winter, being a creature of hunger and sharpness, would sometimes pretend to go soft, coaxing you into carelessness, leaving water barrels uncovered, doors unlatched, or firewood unstacked, just before coming back twice as vicious. Children were told not to run barefoot in the melt, even if it felt warm, because the devil could steal your toes right through the puddles. You remember being told that as a child. You still haven't tested it. Now, the historian's dilemma: was this fear of the thaw based on superstition or genuine risk? Some scholars argue that farmers in this era simply projected their frustrations onto the weather, giving it personality to explain its cruelty. Others suggest they understood more than we give them credit for: the structural threats of freeze-thaw cycles, the danger to livestock health, the way stored vegetables could rot faster in damp conditions. Either way, they didn't trust warm days in February. And neither do you. You try to go about your work, but everything feels off. The snow is slippery now, unpredictable. The paths you've trodden down for weeks have turned to slush, then ice, then slush again. You nearly lose a boot twice walking to the pump, and the well water, warmer than the air for once, smells faintly of earth and iron. You wash your hands in it anyway, just to feel something that isn't frostbitten. Inside the barn, the warmth brings problems. The hay smells sour, moisture creeping in where it shouldn't. One of the goats starts coughing, and you know that sound, not frostbite, not injury, it's a cold, and in this damp, if it spreads, you could lose her. You move her into the empty stall near the firewood pile, bed it thick with straw, and mutter a string of swears under your breath that even the chickens would blush at if they understood English. The children are hopeful. They ask if this means spring is coming. You tell them the truth: no. You've seen winters that fake the end 3 times before giving up. You tell them not to put their boots away yet. Don't unpack the seed bags. Don't start talking about green. That's how the cold sneaks in. It waits for hope, then slams the door shut again. But still, you can't help it. You feel lighter today, even as you slip and nearly fall, even as the gutters drip like leaky faucets. Even as you recover the woodpile for the 100th time, because the snowmelt is trying to soak your only source of heat. There's something in your chest that hasn't stirred in weeks. It's not joy. It's not even optimism. It's just the idea that this might be the halfway mark. That's enough to get you through another day. In the evening, the fog rolls in, thick and low and grey as ash. It seeps into the barn, into the eaves, under the doors. It dulls the edges of everything. You can't see the end of the lane, or the fence post that marks the start of the neighbour's field. It's like the world is shrinking around you, folding inward, wrapping you in something damp and uncertain. You keep the lantern lit longer than usual, just to prove to yourself that light still works. Before bed, you open the door and look out into the fog. It smells like old snow and wood smoke and wet metal. It's quiet, but not peaceful. The kind of quiet that means something's about to happen. You step back inside, lock the door, and bank the fire high. Because you know the thaw never lasts, and the cold is coming back. The storm that follows the thaw doesn't just return, it punishes. You thought you knew cold, you thought the worst had already come and gone. But this is spite from the sky. Like winter's furious, you dared believe it was done. The temperature doesn't just drop, it plummets, like a trapdoor opened beneath the whole countryside. One day you're scraping slush off your boots. The next, your front door is crusted shut with a sheen of ice that looks and feels like it belongs on a frozen lake, not your porch. You spend nearly an hour trying to chip your way out with the fireplace poker, teeth chattering with every swing. The ice creaks in the cracks of the wood. The door groans in protest. When it finally gives way, the hinge snaps, and the whole thing leans like it's considering retirement. You mutter something foul and wedge a chair against it to keep the worst of the wind out. You'll fix it later. Or not. The wind doesn't howl tonight. It screams. Not poetic, not mournful, just pure rage, battering the cottage with fists made of frost and speed. You can hear it through the chimney, the sound rying and falling like some wild beast is caught in the flue. And then the snow starts again. Thick, sideways, relentless. Not the soft kind. These flakes are sharp. They sting your face like sand when you open the barn door. And by the time you shut it again, your eyebrows are frozen together. Here's your historical fact. Following brief thaws, Edwardian winters were often marked by black frosts and snap freezes that were far more destructive than steady cold. These weather whiplashes wreaked havoc on livestock, weakened structures, and made travel impossible. The sudden refreezing of snowmelt turned every path into a hazard and flooded cellars when the thaw returned. If it returned. Now for your fringe detail. Some farmers believed these second storms were the wolf's mouth, a period of fierce cold that devoured the unwary who'd let down their guard after a thaw. It wasn't uncommon for people to sleep fully dressed during these storms, boots beside the bed and shovel within reach, in case they had to dig their way out come morning. Others placed iron nails in the hearth ashes to weigh down the cold, a bit of fire magic meant to keep the worst of it out. And as for the scholarly tug of war, there's been plenty of debate over whether these intense cold snaps were products of climate cycles or exaggerated in memory. Some weather records from the period confirm rapid swings in temperature, while others show only marginal changes. But in the lived experience of isolated farmers, perception mattered more than precision. A 3-day freeze after a brief thaw could mean cracked barrels, frostbitten animals, or collapsed sheds, regardless of what the thermometer said. You brace every corner of the house, you shove rags under the doors, hang quilts over the windows, bank the fire so hot it nearly roars. The kettle boils dry once before you notice. You let it. At least the steam adds a bit of moisture to the air, which now feels like breathing through cloth soaked in salt. The animals are restless. You check the barn twice in one night. The cows are fine but wide-eyed. One of them stomps at the floor like she's angry to be alive. You can relate. The goats huddle together in a pathetic lump of bleating confusion. The hens have gone quiet. You suspect they're plotting a mutiny, or maybe just trying to evolve into penguins. You toss extra hay into the stalls and add bricks to the chicken coop, old ones warmed by the stove. A trick you learned from your mother. She always swore it saved her hens during the storm of '89. Then again, she also swore by singing to bread dough, so her credibility isn't perfect. Back in the house, the windows rattle so hard you're convinced one will just give up and fall in. You sleep in the chair again, boots on, coat still wrapped around you. The fire keeps you company, cracking like it's laughing at your expense. You dream of heat, not summer heat, not beach holidays or fields of flowers. No, you dream of functional warmth. A dry blanket, a steady kettle, the feeling of standing in sunlight without fearing frostbite. You wake up sweating, then realise it's just your body trying to remember what temperature regulation is. At some point before dawn, the wind stops. Just stops. Dead quiet. You know better than to trust that silence. You wait. Listen. Outside, the air has gone still and heavy. You crack the door and look out, and it's a world turned to glass. Everything glitters. Ice on the trees, ice on the roof, ice thick enough to weigh down the fence posts until they tilt like they're trying to lie down. The world looks beautiful, deadly, unreal. You step outside and nearly lose your footing on the top stair. Ice, smooth, clear, treacherous. You catch yourself, curse again, and grab the shovel. Not to dig, just to stay upright. You know what this means. The long freezes here. No more messy melt, no more slush. Just brittle, merciless cold from now until the real thaw comes, which might be weeks away. You make peace with it in stages. 1. Accept that nothing outside will get fixed until the ice lifts. 2. Boil enough water to keep the pump from freezing again. 3. Rotate the animals constantly so nothing gets too stiff or frostbitten. 4. Stop pretending you'll sleep in a bed before March. And 5, maybe the hardest, stop hoping for spring too soon. The thaw tricked you once, it won't do it again. And then, one morning it's just different. Not warm, not yet, but less cruel. The air is still cold but not sharp, the wind still moves but it no longer bites. The snow hasn't melted, but it's slumping around the edges, like it's growing tired of itself. You stand in the doorway in your usual gear, coat, scarf, boots with socks layered so thick your toes forget what breathing feels like. And for the first time in months you don't wince when the wind brushes your cheeks. You just breathe. It's not over. You know better than that. But something has shifted. The world smells faintly of dirt again. Not in the yard, there's still a foot of snow covering everything, but in the barn, under the hay, in the dark corners of the coop where the frost hasn't reached. It's a scent you haven't caught since November. Soil. Cold, damp, half asleep, but awake. You take another deep breath and let it fill your chest like medicine. The animals know it too. The cows are fidgety this morning, stomping more than usual. The dog's tail has started wagging again without being bribed. Even the chickens look vaguely interested in life. One of them actually lays an egg for the first time in weeks. It's small, pale, a little wonky. But an egg. A real egg. You hold it in your hand like treasure. Your historical fact tonight: Edwardian farmers didn't use the calendar to judge the seasons so much as they watched the animals. Egg-laying resumed before the frost melted. Sheep started to shift restlessly before lambing. Birds returned days before anyone saw a bud on the trees. It wasn't instinct, it was observation, passed down from generation to generation. When the hens cluck more, the freeze is close to ending. When the goat starts headbutting the gate again, get ready to plant. And here's your fringe fact. Some families used weather watchers, not tools but people, often older women in the family, who tracked the signs of the shift using everything from the movement of ants to how loudly the kettle steamed. If the kettle hissed more than usual at dawn, they'd declare a change in the wind. Was it scientific? No. Were they usually right? Strangely, yes. You're beginning to suspect your own joints are starting to pick up that kind of wisdom. Now for the historian squabble of the evening. Was the first sign of spring truly an agricultural milestone, or was it more psychological? Some argue these tiny signs, the return of birds, the egg, the melt, gave rural families a mental lifeline more than they had practical value. Others insist these were real calculated markers used to time the first planting, lambing, and even house repairs. But in the end, no one really cared what the textbooks said. They cared what the chicken said, what the mud said, what the sky whispered on the still mornings before dawn. Back in your own cottage, things are beginning to feel possible. You hang the laundry outside again, even though it still freezes stiff within the hour. But something about doing it makes you feel lighter. You sit by the fire and mend the gardening gloves. You oil the rust off the old spade. You look at the seed box. Not long, not with commitment, just a glance, that's all. You go down into the cellar and take inventory again. The potatoes are sprouting, the onions have gone soft in one corner. But there's still enough, just enough. You smile at the sacks like they're old friends who've seen you through a war. Later that day, the children return from a short walk flushed and shouting about something miraculous. A puddle. A real puddle. Not ice, not slush, but water reflecting the sky. You go out to see it, of course. It's barely the size of your hand and surrounded by crusted snow, but it shimmers. The sky in it is pale and grey, but it's there. You watch the ripples, you stick your finger in, cold as ever. But it moves, doesn't crack, doesn't freeze back up before your eyes. That night dinner feels different. Not in ingredients, still root vegetables and dried beans, but in mood. Someone tells a joke. Someone else actually laughs. You remember to light the lamp early and not out of habit, but because you want to. The room looks better with light in it. The shadows feel less like company and more like furniture again. You sleep more deeply that night. The wind is gone. The fire doesn't need feeding at 3 a.m. You wake up under the quilt with warmth in your bones that didn't come from the hearth. And you realise something you haven't dared say in months. You made it. You didn't thrive, you didn't grow, you didn't discover some secret joy in hardship, but you survived. Through the biting winds and coughing nights, the frozen buckets, the snapped shovel handles, the quiet dread. You got through the fake thaws and the real storms. You watched people go, and you stayed. You shivered, you worked. You kept the animals alive. You sewed buttons back on with cracked fingers. You stared at the ceiling and whispered, "Just one more day." And now you get to say, well, that was the last one. The cold will come back. Briefly, maybe more than once, but it'll be weaker, sloppier, beatable. You step out the next morning and hear the faintest creak overhead. You glance up and there, perched on the chimney, is a bird. Just a little one. Brown, ordinary, but it's singing. And that's enough. So, here we are. You've made it through. Not just through one winter storm or one rough week, but through an entire Edwardian winter, with all its teeth bared and breath icy and moods unpredictable. It wasn't just snow and frost, was it? It was the kind of cold that steeps in the walls, the kind that demands silence, patience, and a whole lot of uncomfortable resilience. But more than anything, it demanded your full attention every single day. And you gave it. You woke up before dawn when the bedroom window glistened with ice. You watched the fires glow like it was the only star that mattered. You broke the ice on the animal troughs with a rock you'd warmed in the hearth the night before. You ladled tea made from dried weeds and whispered gratitude when it didn't taste like boiled shoe. You learned that one egg was a miracle, that goose fat can solve suspiciously many problems, and that sometimes the best medicine for frostbite is a dog who refuses to leave your side. But it wasn't just physical survival. It was what you carried in your mind, through the endless repetition, through the weeks of sameness, so thick they blurred the calendar, through the deep quiet when the only sound was the crackle of the fire and your own breathing. You kept going. You played games in candlelight when the children were tired. You hosted stories in barns when the wind wouldn't let you walk straight. You held hands under two thin quilts and reminded each other, soon. Soon the light will last a little longer. Soon the pump won't freeze solid. Soon the barn roof won't groan with the weight of snow. You whispered it like a secret. and now you say it like a promise. You survived the season that used to decide whether you got to plant in spring. That's no small thing. And no matter where you're listening from, maybe a cosy flat in Edinburgh, maybe a small house in Saskatchewan, maybe a city where the snow barely sticks, you've walked in the boots of someone who couldn't escape the winter, who had to outlast it, and you did. So tonight, when you lie down and pull the blanket up just beneath your chin, maybe let the images settle. The frost on the window pane, the scrape of the spade, the first slow drip of the thaw. Let them melt into your thoughts like warm tea. And be glad they belong to someone else's past now. They were hard-earned, and they're finally behind you. Sleep well tonight, friend. Spring's on its way.